Section 1. The nuclear power plant is poisoning Springfield. Get comfortable. Settle in wherever you are right now. Pull the blanket up a little tighter. Rest your head back. Let your eyes go soft. Because for the next 3 hours, we are going somewhere that is simultaneously the most familiar place in the history of American television, and also one of the strangest, darkest, most quietly disturbing fictional locations ever created. We are going to Springfield. The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17th, 1989. 36 seasons. Nearly 800 episodes. It is the longest-running American animated series in history. The longest-running sitcom. The longest-running scripted primetime show that has ever existed on this planet. No other show comes close. Nothing else is even in the conversation. And in all that time, across all those episodes, across 3.5 decades of American life, nobody in Springfield has aged a single day. Bart Simpson is still 10 years old. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still on that pacifier. Homer still stumbles through the door of the nuclear power plant every morning, still sits in the same chair in Sector 7G, still punches the same buttons that he doesn't understand, still falls asleep in front of the same glowing reactor core. And his boss, the ancient, skeletal, impossibly old man who owns the plant and runs the town, still cannot remember his name. That is 36 years of the same morning, over and over again. And nobody in Springfield ever stops and says it. Nobody ever turns to the person next to them and asks the simplest, most human question imaginable. Why aren't we getting older? We're going to ask it. And when we do, we're going to find something underneath this show that most people who have watched every episode, memorized every quote, and laughed at every joke have never quite let themselves see clearly. We're going to find patterns. We're going to find buried storylines that were introduced and never resolved. We're going to find theories so carefully constructed, so thoroughly supported by things the show actually put on screen, that the writers themselves have been forced to address them directly. And we're going to find a version of Springfield that is darker, stranger, and more emotionally complex than the cartoon it pretends to be. So wherever you are right now, let your body get heavy, let your thoughts slow down. And let me take you through something that the show has been hiding in plain sight since the very beginning. Let's start with the one that explains everything. The Springfield nuclear power plant is mutating the entire population of the town. Not as a metaphor, not as a background joke that the writers threw in and forgot about. As a literal, biological, ongoing catastrophe that the show has been documenting in plain sight for over 3 decades, and that the residents of Springfield are either too cognitively impaired to recognize or too psychologically dependent on their circumstances to confront. The evidence for this theory is not subtle. It is not the product of someone squinting at freeze frames and reading meaning into coincidences. It is right there on the surface of the show, repeated across hundreds of episodes, building a picture so complete and so consistent that the real mystery is not whether the plant is poisoning Springfield. The real mystery is how the show has gotten away with telling you this for 36 years while the audience laughed along and never quite connected the dots. Let's begin with what is definitively established within the show's own universe. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the wealthiest man in Springfield, and possibly in the entire state, depending on which episode you are watching. The plant is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town, which means every house in Springfield, every streetlight, every school, every hospital, every small business, every single watt of electricity that flows through the community passes through Charles Montgomery Burns and his facility. And that facility, by any reasonable standard you care to apply, is one of the most horrifying industrial locations ever depicted in fiction. A surprise safety inspection of the plant, conducted in one of the show's earlier seasons, found 342 violations. Think about what that number means for a moment. Not 3 violations, not a dozen, not 50. 342 separate, documented failures to meet basic safety standards at a facility that sits in the middle of a residential community and generates nuclear power. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. Not because he could not afford it. Burns is a billionaire many times over. The money was not the obstacle. Burns refused, because spending the money would mean acknowledging that the violations existed, and acknowledging that the violations existed would mean someone might start asking what 30 years of uncorrected nuclear safety failures had already done to the people who lived downwind of his cracked cooling towers. And some of these violations are not administrative paperwork failures. Some of them are things that should have triggered immediate federal intervention. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water that the town's population draws from. Radioactive waste being deposited on children's playgrounds. Plutonium, actual weapons-grade fissile material, sitting on someone's desk as a paperweight. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats, glowing with radiation, running through the ventilation systems. And then there is the one the show drops almost casually, in passing, the way you might mention that a restaurant had bad parking. Human skeletons in the basement. There are human skeletons in the basement of a working nuclear power plant. The show never explains who those people were. It never tells us how they died or how their remains ended up inside an active industrial facility. It shows you the bones and then moves on. The safety inspector who discovers them notes them down as a violation alongside the chewing gum and the glowing rodents and the plutonium paperweight. And life in Springfield continues exactly as before. Nobody asks a question. Nobody files a report that goes anywhere. Nobody looks at a set of human bones inside a nuclear plant and says that perhaps this particular facility should be shut down and investigated. And the safety inspector who discovered them, the man whose entire professional purpose is to prevent this kind of thing from happening, the person standing between Springfield and radiological catastrophe, is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, a man whose own creator has stated, has an IQ of 55. A man who, as the show eventually reveals, has had a crayon lodged in his brain since early childhood, physically blocking the neural pathways responsible for complex reasoning. A man who sleeps at his workstation during the day, eats donuts when the alarm goes off indicating an approaching meltdown, and who once, in a moment that the show plays as comedy, but should theoretically disqualify him from ever working near a nuclear reactor again, threw a donut into the reactor core to see if radiation would make it grow larger. That is the man responsible for preventing a nuclear disaster in a town of thousands of people. And he has been doing that job, or rather failing to do that job, for over 3 decades. Now here is where the theory begins to develop real weight. The first visible mutant in Springfield appears in Season 2. His name is Blinky. Blinky is a fish. Specifically, he is a fish pulled from a river that runs near the nuclear power plant. And the reason he has a name is the reason the entire town of Springfield knows about him. Blinky has 3 eyes. Not 2, 3. A fully formed, functional third eye growing from the center of his forehead. When Blinky surfaces, he immediately becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate holds Blinky up as evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment and destroying the local ecosystem. Burns is forced to appear on live television and eat the fish to demonstrate that it is perfectly safe and that a 3-eyed fish from a river downstream of a nuclear facility is nothing to be concerned about. The town watches, the town shrugs, the town moves on. Nobody conducts a follow-up study. Nobody tests the water. Nobody commissions an independent environmental assessment of the river. Nobody asks the question that should be so obvious it practically asks itself. If the fish have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The answer has been sitting in the show since Season 8, though it takes the radiation theory to make you see it for what it is. Season 8, Episode 10, The Springfield Files. Homer is walking home through the woods near Springfield and encounters something that terrifies him. A figure that glows with an eerie green light. A figure with enormous eyes and an unnaturally elongated body that moves with a strange, shuffling gait. A figure that hums with some kind of internal energy and radiates an otherworldly calm. Homer tells Marge. Marge is skeptical. Homer insists. The town gets involved. The FBI sends agents. The story escalates into a full investigation of a potential extraterrestrial sighting in Springfield. And the reveal, when it comes, is both funny and, if you are paying the right kind of attention, absolutely terrifying. The alien is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so chemically and radiologically extreme, that it temporarily transforms his appearance. His body glows with a visible green light in the hours after the treatment. His eyes dilate. His body language changes. He wanders out of the treatment facility in a daze, moving through the woods near Springfield, in a state of euphoric disorientation. He literally glows in the dark. Not metaphorically. His skin emits visible light. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he dies. And the people of Springfield, the people who live next to the nuclear power plant, who drink the water downstream from the facility, who breathe the air that surrounds the cracked cooling towers, they see this glowing figure in their forest. And their immediate conclusion is that it must be a visitor from another world. Not radiation, not their power plant, an alien. That is how thoroughly the town has normalized the presence of nuclear contamination in their lives. The sight of a human being glowing green in the woods does not prompt anyone to wonder about the reactor on their skyline. It prompts them to call the FBI and file a UFO report. And then, years later, in a film that the show produced as a theatrical feature, the contamination of Springfield reaches its logical, catastrophic conclusion. In the Simpsons movie, the environmental situation in Springfield deteriorates to a point so severe, so completely beyond the ability of local authorities to manage, that the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States of America determines that the only viable solution is to physically contain the town. They seal it under a dome, a massive glass dome lowered from above, encasing the entire community and cutting it off from the rest of the country. Think about what that means. Not what it means as a plot device in a movie, but what it means as a statement about Springfield. The federal government of the United States looked at Springfield, assessed its environmental situation, and determined that the town was so contaminated, so fundamentally toxic, so dangerous to the surrounding region, that physical quarantine was the appropriate response. Springfield was not fined, it was not placed on a watch list, it was not required to remediate its environmental violations. It was sealed. Like a contaminated laboratory sample. Like a biological hazard. The whole town, every resident, every building, every park and school and bar and church, sealed inside a glass dome, because the government decided that Springfield itself had become a threat to everything outside it. And every single resident of the town was still inside when the dome came down. Now, with all of that established, look at the residents themselves. Look at them carefully. Homer Simpson, a skull shape that does not correspond to any known human biological variation. Bulging eyes that protrude beyond the orbital ridge. A massive underbite. 4 fingers on each hand. An IQ that falls within the range of clinical intellectual disability. A body that heals from injuries that should be fatal with a speed and completeness that has no biological explanation. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted multiple times. He has fallen from cliffs. He has been struck by vehicles. He has survived explosions at close range. He has been crushed by industrial machinery. He has walked away from every single one of these events without permanent damage, often without even a visible recovery period. His pain tolerance is not human. His healing rate is not human. His resilience is not human. He has spent his entire adult life working in direct proximity to an active nuclear reactor, and he works there every day without protective equipment that functions correctly, because the protective equipment at the Springfield plant is one of the 342 documented safety violations. Marge Simpson. The same bulging eyes. The same 4 fingers. Hair that grows straight upward in a rigid tower shape that defies the physical properties of human hair, which cannot achieve that structure without architectural support that is never depicted. She maintains this tower, unchanged in shape or dimension, for 36 years, without it ever shifting during sleep or wind, or any of the physical activities the show depicts her undertaking. Marge worked briefly at the Springfield nuclear power plant herself. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same radiation, the same cracked infrastructure, and all 3 of her children were born after both their parents had already been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart, Lisa, Maggie, all 3 born in Springfield, all 3 raised in Springfield, all 3 drinking the same water from the same river that the 3-eyed fish swims in, all 3 breathing the same air that surrounds the facility with the gum-patched cooling towers. and all three displaying physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations. The hair that holds impossible shapes without product. The overbites. The bulging eyes. The proportions that deviate from standard human anatomy. And the skin? The yellow skin that covers every resident of Springfield and no one who lives outside it. This is the detail that locks the theory into place. When visitors come to Springfield, when celebrities appear as guest characters, when people arrive from outside the town, they look different. Not slightly different. Fundamentally different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes sit within their heads at normal angles. Their features correspond more closely to actual human anatomy. They look, in the context of the show's visual language, more realistic. The standard explanation for this is that it is simply the show's art style. That Springfield residents look the way they do because that is how The Simpsons is drawn. That is how the characters have always looked. But within the internal logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who do not. The people inside the contamination zone look one way, the people outside it look another way. The people inside look like what happens to a human body when it is exposed to generations of low-level radiation and environmental toxins. The people outside look like people. The animals are affected too. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family greyhound, has the same bulging eyes as his owners, the same proportions that deviate from actual canine anatomy. A dog who has lived inside the contamination zone for as long as the family shows the same physical markers as the family themselves. Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is not an anomaly. He is a data point. He is the show explicitly demonstrating what happens to living organisms in the Springfield environment, and then expecting you to believe that the exact same environment has had zero effect on the humans who live there. And at the center of all of this sits one man. Charles Montgomery Burns knows. He has always known. The show makes this explicit. Burns funds private medical research. He employs personal physicians. He undergoes the weekly treatments that we discussed, the treatments that keep him alive through what amounts to managed chronic radiation poisoning. Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield, because Burns is personally dependent on managing its effects in his own body every single week. He has pharmaceutical resources. He has medical infrastructure. He has the ability to synthesize experimental treatments and administer them on a precise schedule. He knows what radiation does to biological systems because radiation is the only thing keeping him alive. And he knows what his plant is doing to Springfield because he built the plant, he owns the plant, he chose not to fix the 342 violations, and he did all of that in a town where he was already watching what unmanaged radiation exposure does to fish. Burns's continued employment of Homer Simpson is not negligence. It is not forgetfulness. When the plant was briefly purchased by German investors in one episode, the very first thing they did was fire Homer. The very next thing they did was assess the true cost of bringing the facility up to code, and the estimate nearly destroyed them financially. Burns bought the plant back immediately and rehired Homer on the same day. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down. Homer ensures the violations continue. The water stays poisoned. The air stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and by extension, its population. A population too cognitively impaired by decades of radiation exposure to understand what has been done to them. The crayon in Homer's brain is the show's most explicit admission of this. The episode in which it is revealed that Homer had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function, is remarkable for several reasons. But the most important is what happens when the crayon is removed. Homer's IQ rises dramatically. He becomes articulate and capable of complex reasoning. He begins to see his life, his job, his town, with a clarity that he has never had before. And he is miserable, because seeing Springfield clearly is unbearable. Understanding what his job actually is, what the plant actually does, what Burns has actually built in the middle of their town, is not something a person can know and continue living the life Homer lives. So he has the crayon put back. He chooses the fog, He chooses the softened, impaired version of reality. He chooses not to know. But here is the question the show never asks. How did a crayon get lodged in a child's brain without anyone noticing? Homer went through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life. He visited doctors in Springfield. He had checkups with Springfield medical professionals, and not one of them found a foreign object in his skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is so incompetent that they cannot detect an object embedded in their patient's brain tissue, or someone knew it was there and chose not to remove it. And if the medical establishment in Springfield is compromised, if the physicians are looking the other way while their patient's neurological function erodes, if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he essentially owns, then Homer's crayon is not an accident. It is a system working exactly as it was designed to work. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains. Something that keeps them compliant and incurious and incapable of looking up at those cracked cooling towers and asking the most fundamental question available to any thinking person. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them simultaneously, in a way that is internally consistent across 36 seasons of material. The characters do not age because their mutated biology has been altered at the cellular level in ways that affect normal aging processes. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's memory function has been compromised by chronic neurological damage from long-term radiation exposure. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that have made him physically resilient, at the cost of his cognitive capacity. Burns stays alive through treatments that would destroy a normal person because he has spent a century managing his own radiation exposure with resources that nobody else in town can access. And nobody questions any of this. Not the fish, not the dome, not the glowing billionaire in the woods, not the bones in the basement. Because the same environmental contamination that changed their bodies also damaged the part of their brains responsible for critical inquiry. Springfield is not a quirky fictional town. It is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant on the hill, the one that provides their electricity and employs their neighbors, and runs on the energy of a cracked reactor, maintained by a man with a 55 IQ, is not a background element in the story. It is the story. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every reset to normal after something world-ending happens. Every mystery that hangs in the Springfield air without resolution. All of it traces back to that same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible damage into the same water supply, feeding the same compromised minds that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have 4 fingers. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not part of The Simpsons. The Springfield nuclear power plant is The Simpsons. And nobody in Springfield will ever understand that because the plant already made sure that they can't. There is something important to sit with here before we move on to the next theory. The radiation theory does not require us to believe that Burns is a villain in any simple cartoonish sense. He is a villain. That much is clear. But he is a villain in the specific, systemic way that the most damaging people tend to be villains, not through discrete acts of obvious evil, but through the patient construction of systems that produce damage as a byproduct of their normal operation. Burns did not sit down one day and decide to poison Springfield. He decided to own a power plant and not spend the money to make it safe, because spending the money would cost him something and he saw no incentive to spend it. He decided to keep Homer employed, because Homer's incompetence was more valuable to him than competence would be. He decided to pursue Mona Simpson across decades because she destroyed something he owned, and Burns does not forgive the destruction of things he owns. Each decision was rational from Burns's perspective. Each decision maximized his position at the cost of someone else's well-being. And the aggregate of all those rational, self-serving decisions, accumulated over decades, is the Springfield we see. A town of yellow-skinned, 4-fingered, ageless, amnesia-prone, 3-eyed, fish-adjacent residents who are too cognitively impaired to understand what happened to them. The most efficient machine Burns ever built was not the sunblocker, it was Springfield itself. And it is still running. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not part of The Simpsons. The Springfield nuclear power plant is the Simpsons. And nobody in Springfield will ever understand that because the plant already made sure that they can't. Section 2. Homer's Coma, the dream that never ended. Now that we have established what Springfield is, what it is made of, and what it does to the people who live there, we need to consider the possibility that none of it is real. Not real in the sense that it is a cartoon, which we already know. Real in the sense that even within the internal logic of the show's own universe, even accepting Springfield as a genuine place populated by genuine people living genuine lives, there is a substantial body of evidence suggesting that every episode you have ever watched might be taking place inside the mind of an unconscious man. A man who has been lying in a hospital bed since April of 1993. A man who went to sleep in the 4th season of the show and never woke up. A man who is dreaming Springfield into existence from the inside of a coma, generating it episode by episode from the fragments of memory and love and grief that remain active in a brain slowly losing function in a hospital room that the show has never returned to. This is the Homer coma theory. It is the most widely discussed, most carefully analyzed, and most emotionally resonant fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. And the reason it has survived for decades, the reason it keeps coming back, the reason fans keep returning to it and building on it, and finding new supporting evidence in new episodes that aired years after the theory was first proposed, is simple. It makes the show make sense in a way that nothing else does. Before we go any further, let us think about what the coma theory is actually asking us to believe. It is not asking us to believe something that violates the show's own internal logic. It is not a theory that requires us to introduce elements that the show has not established. The coma happened. The 5% brain loss happened. The tonal shift after season 4 happened. The fact that nobody ages happened. The increasingly surreal escalation of the show's plots happened. These are all documented, canonical, observable facts about the show. The coma theory simply asks us to consider whether these facts are related to each other in the specific way the theory proposes. And the answer, when you lay the evidence out carefully, is that they might be. Let's begin at the beginning. April 1st, 1993. Season 4, Episode 18. The title is, So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise is, on the surface, a very ordinary Simpsons episode. Bart, inspired by April Fool's Day, plays a series of pranks on Homer, each one escalating slightly beyond the last. The final prank involves Homer's beer. Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker, the kind used to mix paint before it is applied. He shakes the can until the pressure inside it is at a level far beyond what the container was designed to hold. Homer opens the can. The explosion is significant enough to send him to the hospital. This is where the episode should end, as far as most Simpsons episodes go. Homer gets hurt. Homer recovers. Homer goes home and the family watches television. That is the structure. That is how these things go. But this episode does something different. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed, still recovering from the explosion, he notices a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for it. The vending machine, unbalanced by his reaching, tips forward, and it falls on him. And Homer Simpson flatlines. The show is clear about this. He does not merely lose consciousness. He does not fall into a deep sleep. He clinically dies and then enters a coma. A real, extended, medically defined coma that the show treats with unusual weight and seriousness for an episode that began with Bart shaking a beer can. The family gathers at his bedside. Bart is racked with guilt. Lisa plays her saxophone outside his window because she read somewhere that music can reach people in comas. Marge keeps her vigil with the quiet, devoted terror of a woman who has just been shown how easily she could lose everything. And Homer lies there, unconscious, for 7 weeks. Then the episode ends with what appears to be a resolution. Bart sits at Homer's bedside, tearful, and confesses everything. He tells his unconscious father that the whole thing was his fault. He tells Homer he is sorry, and Homer, as if responding to the one thing that could reach him through the fog, springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Homer laughs. Everything returns to normal. The credits roll. Case closed. Homer woke up. The show continues. Except, in the final moments of the episode, before the credits, the show reveals something that it immediately treats as a throwaway joke and then never meaningfully addresses again. During the coma, Homer lost 5% of his brain function. Permanently. The damage is irreversible. 5% of his brain is simply gone, destroyed by the period of unconsciousness, and it is never coming back. Homer's response to learning that he has sustained permanent, irreversible neurological damage is to laugh. To laugh about it, he says, even though he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The show runs for 32 more years without ever returning to this moment. Unless it never left. The Homer coma theory, originally articulated by a Reddit user and then built upon by thousands of people across many years, proposes something deceptively simple. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. The moment when he opens his eyes and strangles Bart is not a real awakening. It is a dream event. The beginning of the dream, not the end of the coma. Every episode that has aired since that date, every single one, is a dream being generated inside the mind of a man in a hospital bed in Springfield General. Every adventure, every job, every celebrity encounter, every near-death experience, of which there are hundreds, every heartwarming resolution, every couch gag, every guest appearance, all of it is Homer's unconscious mind constructing a life it is no longer living. The evidence is not circumstantial, it is structural. Consider what the show looks like before the coma. Before Season 4, Episode 18, The Simpsons is a grounded show. Not realistic in a documentary sense. It was always a cartoon, always heightened, always willing to use absurdity for comic effect. But the stories it told were rooted in recognizable human experience, financial stress, marital tension, academic failure, parenting anxiety, the fear that you are not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough to give your family the life they deserve. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers whether the life she chose is really the life she wants. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and experiences, for the first time, the particular devastation of idealized admiration giving way to reality. Bart faces the possibility of being held back a year at school and has to reckon with what that means about who he is. These are stories about a family. A specific, believable, emotionally coherent family, navigating the ordinary disasters of ordinary life. After the coma, everything changes. Not gradually, suddenly, seismically. Homer goes to space. Not metaphorically. He is selected by NASA and launches on an actual space shuttle mission. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group, and then joins a secret society, and then discovers that his mother is alive and has been a fugitive activist for decades, and then meets God face to face and has an extended conversation about the meaning of his life. The show transforms from a domestic sitcom with the texture of real family experience into something closer to a fever dream, a place where the main character has held over 60 different jobs, traveled to dozens of countries, met sitting presidents, befriended global celebrities, and survived physical trauma that would kill an entire platoon of soldiers. The internet has spent 20 years debating when The Simpsons got bad. What people usually mean is that at some point the show stopped feeling real, stopped feeling grounded, stopped having the weight and specificity of the early seasons, and became something broader and louder and less emotionally coherent. The coma theory says those people are right about the shift, wrong about the explanation. The Simpsons did not get bad. Homer's brain got worse. And the escalating unreality of the later seasons is not a decline in writing quality. It is a faithful representation of what happens to a dream when the mind generating it begins to deteriorate. Dreams start coherent. They follow emotional logic, if not always physical logic. They concern the things that matter to the dreamer. Family, security, belonging, love. And then, as sleep deepens and brain activity shifts, they become stranger. The logic loosens. Connections become associative rather than causal. Things happen because the dream needs them to happen, not because they follow from anything that came before. The early seasons are coherent Homer. The later seasons are deteriorating Homer. The show did not change because the writers changed. The show changed because the dream is changing. And here is the detail that haunts the theory more than any other. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a direct conversation with God. Not a dream sequence, not a hallucination. A face-to-face theological conversation with the actual divine presence. And during that conversation, in the episode Homer the Heretic, God says something to Homer that reads, in retrospect, like a prophecy. God tells Homer that he will one day learn the meaning of life. But not yet. Not yet. His time, God says, is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline matches with an exactness that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A divine figure, within the show's own established canon, tells Homer that his time is nearly up. 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ends, and the dream begins. God was not telling Homer about enlightenment. God was telling Homer about the vending machine. And the thing about the coma theory that makes it genuinely difficult to shake, even for people who are fully aware that they are watching an animated sitcom, and that reading this kind of meaning into a cartoon requires a certain suspension of critical distance, is how precisely it explains the single most persistent question about The Simpsons. Nobody ages. Every theory about this show has to grapple with this fact. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not aged a day since the show began. The standard industry explanation is that this is simply how long-running animated shows work. Characters are locked at their ages to maintain the show's format and dynamic, and you simply accept it because it is a cartoon. But the coma theory does not need a meta-explanation. It has an in-universe answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing older because he was not there to watch it happen. His mental image of Bart is the mental image of a 10-year-old boy. Because the last time Homer's conscious mind registered Bart's age, Bart was 10 years old. His memory of Marge is a woman who looks exactly as she looked on the day the vending machine fell. His friends and neighbors are preserved at the age they were when the coma began, because his sleeping mind has no new information to update them with. Homer's coma dream is not a story about the future, it is a recreation of the present, as it existed on the day he lost it. And in a coma, the present does not move. It cannot move. It stays exactly where it was when the darkness came, preserved in a kind of emotional amber, perfect and still and unchanging. Of course, the children do not age. He cannot let them age. Aging means time passing, and time passing means growing up. And growing up means the family he is dreaming about is no longer the family he went into the coma loving. His brain is holding them at the last version of themselves he knew. The celebrity appearances in the later seasons make sense under this framework as well, and they make sense in a way that is slightly melancholy if you let it be. Homer is lying in a hospital room. There is a television somewhere nearby. There are voices from the hallway, conversations at his bedside, a radio playing from a nurse's station down the corridor. His dreaming brain is receiving fragments of the outside world as ambient stimulus, sounds and voices and names without context, and it is incorporating those fragments into the dream. When a celebrity shows up in Springfield to meet the Simpsons, it is not because Springfield has somehow become a magnet for the famous. It is because Homer's comatose brain heard a voice on a television he cannot see and wove that voice into the narrative it was already generating. Every celebrity who ever appeared in Springfield is a signal Homer intercepted through the fog of his unconsciousness, translated into a dream character by a mind that is doing everything in its power to keep the story running. The show itself has acknowledged this theory, in the oblique, half-admitted way that The Simpsons has of acknowledging things it does not want to confirm. In season 34, there was a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene, officially framed as something hackers had gotten hold of and released without authorization, in which Homer wakes up from a long coma, and the moment of waking reveals that everything that happened in the show's wilder seasons was a dream. The show's writers animated this. They made it, they showed it, and then they immediately said it was a fake, a hoax, a planted piece of misinformation. But the fact that they made it at all says something. They know the theory. They have lived with the theory. They have engaged with it seriously enough to produce visual material responding to it. And their denial came wrapped inside an episode that explicitly showed Homer waking from a coma, as if the only way to address the theory was to directly enact it, and then claim you were not. They showed you the truth and told you it was a joke. And the audience laughed. Just like Homer laughed when he was told he had permanently lost 5% of his brain function. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory in 2015. He said it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation and moved on. But there are several things he did not address. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the dramatic and consistent tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show becomes progressively more surreal and disconnected from physical reality with every passing season, in exactly the manner you would expect of a dream being generated by a brain whose function is slowly declining. He said it was not true. The fans did not stop believing it. Because the theory does something that no official statement has ever managed to do. It makes the entire show make sense. The aging freeze. The tonal shift. The celebrity flood. The increasingly physics-defying plots. The reset button that erases consequences between episodes. The fact that Homer can survive anything, endure anything, recover from anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed, only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him, because his mind is the instrument generating the story, and you cannot end a story from inside it. But there is something else about the coma theory that tends to stay with people long after they have closed the browser tab or turned off the video. If it is true, then the emotional core of The Simpsons is not a comedy. It is a love letter from a dying man to the family he cannot reach. Homer's deepest wish is so simple, it is almost painful to articulate. He wants his family. That is the whole of it. He wants Marge to still be there. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, infuriating, fundamentally good-hearted little boy. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone in her room, still trying to make the world better, with the ferocity of a child who has not yet learned how large the world is. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in the crook of his arm. He wants a Friday night at the Simpson house to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives Homer everything he wants in the only way it can. It freezes everything at the moment he loved it most. It keeps his family young and present and close. It runs the same story over and over with minor variations, always returning to the same house, the same couch, the same family by the end of every episode, because the dream knows that Homer needs to come home. He needs it, and so he always does. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever want. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always young, and the beer is always cold, and nobody ever has to grow up, and nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every time the show resets, every time the credits roll, and everything returns to normal, despite whatever impossible thing happened in the preceding 22 minutes, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream stops, if the mind finally quiets, then Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed, or worse, not waking up at all. That is the coma theory. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April 1993. Every episode you have ever watched since that date is a love letter written by an unconscious father to the family he cannot reach. The show will never confirm this, but it will never disprove it either. Because the evidence is not in the text of any single episode. It is in the structure of the show itself, baked into the logic of a world that refuses to age, populated by people who cannot explain why things keep resetting, telling stories that grow stranger and more dreamlike with every passing year. Nobody ages. Reality keeps getting softer, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Because in the dream, he never left. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before we continue, let me be clear about something. The show told you who did it. Season 7, Episode 1. Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 2. The investigation resolves. Baby Maggie Simpson is identified as the shooter. Case closed. The writers committed to the answer. The producers stand behind it. And it has been the official position of The Simpsons for nearly 30 years. and the case was never actually closed. Not really, because the more carefully you look at the evidence, the clues, the timeline, the established facts, and the circumstances surrounding both the shooting and its resolution, the more clearly you can see the seams in the official story. The places where the explanation does not quite fit the facts it is supposed to explain. This is the greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons, and arguably the greatest mystery in the history of animated television. And the reason it remains a mystery, the reason it is still being discussed and analyzed and debated nearly 3 decades after the resolution aired, is that the official answer raises more questions than it answers. Let us go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. The summer of 1995. The Simpsons had been on the air for 6 years. It was at the height of its cultural influence, and it was about to attempt something that had never been done before by an animated series, a genuine, carefully constructed, metatextually sophisticated murder mystery designed to play out across a summer hiatus and reward close attention with a satisfying resolution. The show's promotion of the event was extraordinary. Fox produced tie-in specials. America's Most Wanted ran a segment treating the fictional crime as an actual unsolved case, listing Mr. Burns as a real victim and asking viewers to submit theories about who had pulled the trigger. A national contest was announced, inviting viewers to submit their guesses. The winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. The Simpsons was not just a television program that summer, it was a national puzzle. And to understand why the official answer is so unsatisfying, you first need to understand what an extraordinary setup the show constructed. By the end of Part 1, Mr. Burns had systematically destroyed the lives of an almost comically comprehensive cross-section of Springfield's population. He had arranged for an oil well to be drilled beneath Springfield Elementary School, stealing the oil and taking the revenue that should have gone to fund the school's educational programs. The school lost its budget. Teachers lost their jobs. Students lost their resources. He had financially ruined Moe's Tavern, forcing Moe into bankruptcy through what amounted to economic bullying. He had created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle, leaving dozens of elderly residents, including Grandpa Simpson, without a home. He had arranged for Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, to be injured. And for his finale, his grand gesture, the act that transformed a collection of individual grievances into a town-wide crisis with genuine life-or-death stakes, Burns built a device capable of blocking out the sun, not reducing sunlight, blocking it entirely. A massive mechanical disc, positioned to cast a permanent shadow over all of Springfield, so that every resident would be forced to use artificial lighting around the clock, and would therefore be dependent on his power plant for every watt of electricity required to make their lives function. Burns was going to steal the sun from Springfield to force the entire town to buy electricity from him. When Smithers, his loyal assistant of decades, protested, Burns fired him on the spot. The town assembled for a public meeting. Dozens of characters arrived carrying weapons. The tension in the room was explicit, and the show took considerable care establishing individual motives for essentially the entire cast of Springfield regulars. Homer, because Burns had never once been able to remember his name despite the two men having worked in close proximity for years. This was not a minor irritant in the episode. It was treated as a genuine compounding humiliation that had been building for a long time. Bart and Lisa, because the theft of the school's oil money had gutted the institution where they spent most of their waking hours. Grandpa Simpson, because Burns had destroyed the building where he lived. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job when the school lost its funding. Tito Puente, because the music program was cut. Moe, because his bar was gone. Even Smithers, freshly fired, his decades of loyalty dismissed in an instant, spiraling into what the episode presents as something close to an emotional breakdown. The entire town had reason. And then Burns was shot. He staggered out of the town meeting and collapsed onto a sundial in the town square, his hands landing on 2 letters of the dial's face, W and S, from one perspective. Or, from Burns's perspective, as he lay facing upward, M and S. The screen went black. America had to wait. When the resolution came in the fall of 1995, It played out as a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum and his officers fumbled through the investigation with their characteristic incompetence. Smithers confessed almost immediately, which seemed to solve everything, until his confession fell apart. He had been blackout drunk on the night of the shooting. He had fired a weapon, yes, but he had shot Jasper in his wooden leg, not Burns. Wrong victim, wrong location, wrong crime. Suspects were eliminated one by one. Alibis were established. Tito Puente received what the show presented as the greatest alibi in television history, a full musical number in which he explained that he had channeled his rage into a samba rather than violence. The investigation stalled until an eyelash was found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis was conducted. The eyelash belonged to a Simpson. Homer was arrested. He had the clearest motive. He had been pushed to a breaking point by Burns's inability to remember his name. His fingerprints were on the gun. The evidence pointed at him so clearly that conviction seemed inevitable. Then Burns regained consciousness. He looked around the hospital room, and he said it was Maggie. According to Burns, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He had attempted to take her lollipop, as he apparently felt entitled to do. During the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun went off. Burns was shot. Chief Wiggum noted that no jury in the world would convict a baby. Case closed. Except, the investigation itself, when you examine it closely, is less a procedural and more a theater of convenient elimination. Chief Wiggum, the man leading the inquiry, has demonstrated across dozens of episodes that his understanding of law enforcement ranges from limited to actively counterproductive. The investigation does not build carefully toward its conclusion. It eliminates suspects through coincidence and accident until only one remains. And then it accepts the testimony of a man who just emerged from a coma as the definitive resolution. Burns wakes up. Burns names someone. The case closes. Everyone goes home. The person Burns names cannot be convicted. If you were the actual shooter watching Burns regain consciousness in that hospital room, you would need exactly one thing to happen in order to be safe. You would need Burns to name someone other than you. Someone whose identification would close the case without creating new legal exposure for anyone actually present. A baby who stumbled across a gun in a parking lot meets every one of those requirements. Let us start with the contest, because the contest tells us something important. Fox invited viewers across America to submit their guesses. The prize was significant. And according to the DVD commentary for both episodes, when the producers reviewed the submitted entries after the resolution aired, they found that in the sample of guesses they checked, not a single person had correctly identified Maggie as the shooter before the answer was revealed. Nobody won. The person who was eventually awarded the prize was chosen randomly from the submission pool. And because they did not have the right answer, they received a cash settlement rather than being animated into an episode. The writers acknowledged on the commentary that they were aware of one person who had posted the correct answer to an online Simpsons discussion group on the night the first episode aired. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the producers tried to track them down, the account had been closed. The one person who got it right had vanished, and the show could not find them. They even issued an open invitation for that person to come forward on the DVD release. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what the contest result actually means. The show's creators designed a mystery, told the public it was solvable from the clues presented in Part 1, promoted a national contest around solving it, and when the answer was revealed, essentially no one had figured it out. Either the clues were insufficient, or the red herrings were too effective, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence the way the show's promotion implied it would. All three of these things may be true simultaneously. Now look at the clues themselves. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands point to W and S, or from his perspective, M and S. The show tells us this indicates Maggie Simpson. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns stated explicitly, on camera, as a canonical plot point within the episode, that his hands pointing at those letters was not intentional. He did not deliberately position himself on the sundial to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell. The positioning of his hands was accidental. The central piece of evidence that the show uses to justify its answer was described by the victim himself as a coincidence. The sundial is not a clue. It is a red herring that the show retroactively tried to use as a clue, and then had to admit, in the episode itself, that it did not actually mean anything. The gun presents another problem. Burns carried a gun in a holster. Shortly before the shooting, the show depicted the holster as empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack. This means whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, not a weapon they brought themselves. The shooter was someone who did not arrive at the town meeting planning to shoot anyone. Someone who encountered Burns's gun by chance and used it in a moment of opportunity. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this. Yes. But so does a dozen other characters. Any of the people at the meeting who were not among the many who arrived already armed, who encountered the situation without a weapon of their own, who might have seen Burns's gun lying in the parking lot and made an impulsive decision. The most important clue, the one that cuts most directly against the official answer, is something Burns says just before he is shot. His last words before the gun fires are, "Oh, it's you. Oh, it's you." Not a scream of fear, not a surprised exclamation, a recognition, a calm, slightly weary acknowledgement of a specific person in a specific moment. The tone of a man who has just run into someone he knows and does not particularly want to deal with. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he ever had a meaningful interaction with her before this episode? The show does not establish a relationship between Burns and Maggie prior to the shooting. Burns barely recognizes Homer. Homer works for him. Homer has worked in his building, in his facility, in proximity to his office, for years, and Burns cannot consistently remember his name. The idea that Burns would look at a baby in a parking lot and say, in a tone of calm recognition, "Oh, it's you," as if greeting a familiar acquaintance whose identity he knew clearly, does not fit the characterization of a man who cannot recognize his own employee of many years. And then there is Season 18. In Season 18, Homer tells someone that he was actually the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says this out loud, on camera, in a canonical episode. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Nobody responds to Homer confessing to the attempted murder of the richest man in Springfield with anything beyond mild acknowledgement. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is absolutely something Homer would do, or the original verdict was wrong and Homer is telling the truth, and the reason nobody responds to his confession is that there is an unspoken understanding in Springfield that the case is closed in the official sense rather than the accurate sense. And opening it again would be inconvenient for everyone involved. If Homer did it, then Maggie was framed. A baby was blamed for a crime committed by her father, by a victim who had just woken from a coma, and whose testimony was the only evidence pointing at anyone in particular. Chief Wiggum's own assessment of the situation was that no jury would convict a baby, which means that from the moment Maggie was named, the case was functionally guaranteed to end without prosecution, regardless of whether she actually did it. Maggie was the perfect resolution. Too young to deny the accusation. Too young to understand it. Too young to ever face consequences for it. If someone with influence over the investigation wanted to protect the real shooter, blaming Maggie was the cleanest possible move. One of the most compelling alternative theories involves Marge as the shooter, and it is stronger than it initially appears. Marge is a devoted mother and wife. Burns had destroyed her children's school, injured her family's dog, and had now positioned himself to steal the son from the town where her family lived. She had as much reason as anyone in Springfield to want him stopped. But there is a specific detail that connects Burns and Marge beyond simple motive. In the episode Marge Gets a Job, which aired several seasons before the shooting, Burns becomes infatuated with Marge. He falls for her. The attraction is played for comedy, as these things tend to be on The Simpsons, but it establishes something that matters in the context of this theory. Burns knows who Marge is. He has a specific, personal response to her. He has feelings about her that are categorically different from his feelings about any other resident of Springfield. If Marge was the one who shot Burns, it would explain something that nothing else in the official story explains. Why didn't Burns name her? He woke from a coma. He was asked to identify his attacker. He pointed at a baby. If the person who shot him was Marge, and if the feelings Burns developed for her in that earlier episode were still present, even residually, even subconsciously, he might have protected her. He might have woken up, seen Marge standing in the room with her family, and made a split-second decision to give a different answer than the true one. He took the bullet. And rather than name the woman he had once been drawn to, he pointed at the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions. Maggie became the answer, because Maggie was convenient. The show knows this interpretation exists. The final shot of Part 2 is one of the most deliberately ambiguous images in the series. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around, carefully, checking that she is unobserved. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics the pulling of a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. She did it. She knows she did it. But watch it again with a different assumption. A baby who witnessed someone else shoot a man. A baby who watched an adult perform a specific action that resulted in a loud noise and a lot of chaos. A baby doing what babies do, which is imitate the behavior of the adults around them. Maggie is not confessing. Maggie is remembering. The alternate endings confirm that the writers were not fully committed to the official answer from the beginning. A complete alternate conclusion was animated, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Full length, fully produced, fully voiced. This ending was shown during a clip show, in which the host dismisses it by saying that accepting it would require ignoring all the Simpson family DNA evidence, which would be, and this is a direct quote, downright nutty. The show is winking at you. It is explicitly referencing the O.J. Simpson trial, in which a jury famously chose not to convict despite DNA evidence, and it is using that reference to tell you, just beneath the surface, that ignoring DNA evidence happens. That official verdicts and actual truth are not always the same thing. That the evidence can point in whatever direction the people in power want it to point. Even the script itself went through multiple iterations. An early draft had Barney as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously. The answer was not predetermined. The clues were built to accommodate whatever answer the writers eventually landed on. Not the other way around. The mystery was reverse-engineered. In a town where every person had a motive, where dozens of people were carrying weapons, where the victim had just stolen the sun, how is it possible that only one person acted? Springfield is not a community known for restraint. These people form mobs over minor disagreements. They have rioted for less. But when the richest man in town blocks out the sun and threatens every living thing in the community with his unchecked greed, only one person pulls a trigger. Either the population exercised extraordinary collective restraint in the single most provocative moment in Springfield's history, or the shooting was not as spontaneous as the official story requires. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The writers stand behind it. But the contest that nobody won, the clue that Burns himself said was meaningless, the alternate endings that were fully produced, the season 18 confession that nobody investigated, the final image of Maggie alone, in a room performing a gesture that could mean two entirely different things depending on what you assume, all of it leaves the question open. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those are two very different things. Section 4. How Mr. Burns is still alive. There is a man in Springfield who is older than the 20th century. Not in the way that fictional characters are sometimes written as implausibly old for comic effect, where the joke is the number and the story moves on. In The Simpsons, the age of Charles Montgomery Burns is a recurring mystery, a multi-episode investigation, a question the show keeps returning to across decades of material without ever arriving at a clean answer. And the question is not merely about how long he has lived. The question is how. By what mechanism does a man with every known disease existing simultaneously in his body, with physical frailty so extreme that a small breeze can knock him over, with organs that should have ceased functioning generations ago, continue to not just survive but operate? To run a billion-dollar corporation. To manipulate local politics with strategic sophistication. To remember, with startling clarity, events from the early 1900s that everyone around him knows only from history books. How is Mr. Burns still alive? The canon of the show places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has personally referenced memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before most of his current employees were born. He has discussed the Gilded Age, not as a period he read about, but as a time he participated in personally. By conservative estimate, Burns is somewhere north of 130 years old. By some readings of the show's floating and often contradictory chronology, he may be older. And he does not merely exist in that age, he functions. His physical body is, by any observable standard, in ruins. His skeleton is nearly visible through his skin. His hands are so weak that he once had difficulty lifting a phone receiver. He requires Smithers' assistance for tasks as basic as putting on a coat. A small child once bested him in a physical confrontation by not moving out of his way. But his mind is something else entirely. Burns is, by a significant margin, the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield. His schemes are multi-layered, long-term, and designed with a sophistication that consistently exceeds the ability of anyone around him to anticipate or counter. He understands finance, law, politics, human psychology, and the specific weaknesses of every person he has ever needed to manipulate. He has been operating at this level, sustaining this cognitive function, for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained consciousness. The show's most direct address of the Burns longevity question comes in the Springfield files, which we have already discussed in the context of the radiation theory. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so extreme that it temporarily transforms his physical appearance. His body glows with a visible green light. His eyes dilate. He wanders out of the treatment facility in a post-treatment daze that makes him look, to the untrained eye, like something other than human. The treatment, the show makes clear, is what keeps him alive. It does not slow his decline or moderate his deterioration. It reverses it, temporarily, for exactly 7 days. At the end of that 7-day window, without another treatment, Burns would die. His survival is not a biological condition. It is a scheduled maintenance procedure. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine, through regular, precise, non-negotiable servicing. Miss one appointment and the machine breaks down. The margin for error is 0. And the treatment itself involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear power plant. The man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's water supply for decades. Whose cooling towers are patched with chewing gum, whose safety record has generated 342 documented violations, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological functions. Burns is not merely profiting from nuclear power. He is powered by it. His body has been so thoroughly altered by proximity to nuclear material over so many decades that it can no longer maintain itself through normal cellular processes. The radiation treatments are not medicine in any conventional sense. They are maintenance. His body needs external radiation input the way a standard human body needs food and water, as a regular, required biological input without which the system fails. Remove the treatments, and Burns collapses within a week. This leads to the most famous medical scene in the show's history, a scene so quoted and so referenced that it has become one of the defining images of the character. Burns visits a doctor, who conducts a thorough examination. The results are extraordinary. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Not a selection of diseases. Not an unusually large number of diseases. Every single one, simultaneously, all present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains what should be immediately recognized as an impossibility. All of these diseases are killing Burns at the same time. Every illness is competing for biological dominance. Every condition is trying to become the terminal one. And, because they are all present simultaneously, because every disease is being blocked by every other disease in a constant, ongoing three-dimensional biological standoff, none of them can gain the foothold required to actually kill him. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome. 3 people trying to get through a doorway at once, each preventing the others from passing. Burns's diseases are in a state of perfect, self-sustaining equilibrium, each one canceling out all the others, creating a biological gridlock that prevents any single illness from progressing. The doctor's conclusion: Burns is the sickest man in the United States of America and functionally indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being blocked by everything else that should kill him. If you accept the radiation theory, this becomes coherent rather than absurd. Burns's body is not maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural biological process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. The treatments do not cure his diseases. They do not eliminate any condition. They manage the balance. They keep every illness in the precise state of stasis required to prevent any single one from gaining dominance and killing him. It is not medicine. It is calibration. His body is a system requiring constant, precise adjustment to prevent catastrophic failure. And Smithers is the calibration engineer. Smithers manages Burns' schedule. He ensures Burns makes every weekly appointment without exception. He monitors Burns' physical condition with an attentiveness that has been noted by fans and critics as going beyond devotion and approaching something closer to obsession. The show depicts Smithers' feelings for Burns as complex and layered, combining genuine affection, professional loyalty, and something that begins to look like existential necessity the more carefully you examine it. Because if Smithers is managing a treatment schedule without which Burns dies, then Smithers' relationship to Burns is not merely emotional, it is functional. It is Smithers' specific competence, his organizational precision, his meticulous attention to schedules and details that keeps Burns alive. Without Smithers, Burns misses a dose. Without the dose, the disease equilibrium collapses. Without the equilibrium, Burns is simply a very old man, with every disease known to medicine, and no treatment managing any of them. Smithers is not devoted to Burns out of love alone. He is devoted because he understands, at some level, that his absence is a death sentence. Burns's connection to historical events adds another dimension to the question. The show has depicted him referencing an extraordinary range of historical periods as personal experience. He is described knowing Howard Hughes. He attended Yale, which he does not remember fondly. He served in World War II, in a capacity that the show suggests was morally complex at best. He is known to have stolen a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for decades. He has referenced the Gilded Age, the Spanish-American War, and periods of American history predating the Industrial Revolution as contexts in which he was personally present. Each of these references, individually, could be attributed to the show's floating timeline or to an inconsistency in the writer's handling of the character. Burns is sometimes depicted as very old and sometimes as merely very wealthy, and the show occasionally uses that ambiguity as a source of comedy. But taken collectively, these references paint a picture of a man who has been present at the defining moments of American history for over a century, who has known its power players personally, who has participated in its institutions at the highest levels and has used those relationships to build and maintain an empire that outlasted all of the individuals he built it with. Burns did not merely survive the 20th century, he shaped parts of it. And the question of how he did that, of what precise combination of wealth and radiation management and ruthless strategic thinking allowed one man to bridge the span from the Gilded Age to the present, with his faculties intact and his power undiminished, is one that the show has never answered directly. It has only hinted. The weekly treatments, the disease equilibrium, the Smithers Protocol, the pharmaceutical infrastructure, the private physicians, the resources to synthesize experimental interventions decades before they would be available to anyone else. Burns has had every advantage that money can provide in the specific project of staying alive, and he has used all of them, continuously, for a span of time that begins to resemble something closer to an institutional lifespan than a personal one. He is not a man anymore, in some important sense. He is a system, a self-perpetuating structure of wealth and infrastructure and biological maintenance that happens to be organized around the continuity of a single personality. And that personality is very old, very patient, and very good at identifying the specific arrangements that allow it to continue to exist. His family, the Burns dynasty, is depicted as one of the oldest continuously operating power structures in American history. Not merely wealthy, but the kind of wealthy that shapes political and economic landscapes across generations. The kind of wealthy that builds infrastructure and charges everyone else to use it for the rest of time. The kind of wealthy that exists so far above the concept of legal accountability that the concept becomes theoretical rather than practical. Burns inherited this legacy and has been extending it for over a century. But here is the question the show leaves deliberately unanswered. Is Burns unique? Or has the Burns family always found ways to extend their lifespans beyond normal human limits? If the current Burns has been alive for over 130 years through artificial means, if his survival depends on a technological intervention that must be repeated weekly for as long as he intends to remain alive, is it possible that previous generations of the Burns family employed different methods with the same goal? Before nuclear radiation, before modern medicine, before any of the specific technology that currently keeps Burns operational, did the Burns dynasty use other mechanisms to maintain their hold on power across time periods that normal humans cannot bridge? The show does not answer this. But it does establish that the Burns family has been in continuous, unbroken control of their fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not happen through ordinary generational succession. Normal wealthy families fragment over generations. Fortunes get divided, mismanaged, depleted. Historical disruptions, wars, economic collapses, political upheavals claim even the most established dynasties over enough time. But the Burns wealth persists. The Burns influence persists. The Burns name persists as a continuous thread running through American history from before the country was fully formed to the present day. That requires either extraordinary luck or extraordinary measures. Burns has also survived an almost comical catalog of attempts on his life and threats to his physical well-being. He has been shot by Maggie Simpson, an event we have already discussed at length. He has been hospitalized dozens of times for injuries and illnesses that would be fatal to any ordinary person. He has collapsed, been attacked, been abandoned in the wilderness, been poisoned, been left in situations that should have resolved themselves with his death, and every single time he comes back, not through the cartoon resilience that allows Homer to survive impossible things and walk away unscathed. Homer's survival is passive, an expression of the show's comedic logic applied to its protagonist. Burns's survival is active. It is deliberate. It is engineered. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever influenced or corrupted, every politician he has ever purchased, every medical professional he has ever retained, every piece of pharmaceutical and technological infrastructure he has ever built or acquired, all of it serves a single purpose: keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the empire he has spent over a century constructing collapses under the weight of everything it has done, and there is no one with the knowledge, the resources, or the institutional memory to keep the machinery operational. And Springfield needs it to stay operational. The town's entire economy depends on the power plant. The power plant's continued operation, with its 342 safety violations intact and its contamination ongoing, depends on Burns's control of it. Burns's control depends on his continued existence. His continued existence depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the pharmaceutical and medical infrastructure that his wealth provides. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the man, the machine, the wealth, and the chemical maintenance all feed each other in a cycle that cannot be interrupted without collapsing the entire structure. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. Or at least, Springfield cannot survive without the power plant. And the power plant, with all its violations and all its contamination and all the damage it has done to the people living downwind of it, is inseparable from the man who owns it. Burns is the oldest man in Springfield, and possibly in the country. He is kept alive by weekly radiation treatments that no one else has access to. He is sustained by a fortune that predates the nation itself. He is protected by an assistant whose organizational competence is, functionally, a medical necessity, and he is surrounded by a population whose cognitive function has been compromised enough by the plant's own byproducts that they cannot consistently form the question that his existence most urgently demands. How old is this man? What has he done to still be here? And what is he willing to do to stay here for another 100 years? He is not immortal in any mystical sense. He has not found a shortcut around mortality. He has built a system so expensive, so comprehensive, and so precisely calibrated that dying has simply become economically inefficient. And Springfield will keep paying for that system, in electricity bills and contaminated water, and compromised neurological function, and three-eyed fish and children, with 4 fingers and yellow skin, for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if the treatment schedule holds, will be forever. Section 5. The truth about Maggie Simpson. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She has never walked reliably. She communicates primarily through facial expressions and pacifier movements, and the occasional sound that could be interpreted as meaningful if you are paying close enough attention. She has, in the show's entire run, spoken one word, Daddy, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a brief cameo, and the word was never repeated. As far as the show is concerned, Maggie Simpson is a pre-verbal infant who has been in a state of arrested development since December of 1989. And in that time, without saying a word, without walking anywhere with any particular consistency, without drawing attention to herself in any of the ways that the other members of her family cannot seem to stop doing, Maggie has done more than all of them combined. She shot a billionaire. She led a rebellion in a daycare facility against a tyrannical caretaker and won. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations, using problem-solving approaches that would challenge most adults. She has demonstrated, repeatedly and consistently, cognitive abilities that should not exist in a child who cannot yet form sentences. And she has done all of it quietly, without announcement, without seeking acknowledgement, without drawing the kind of attention that would prompt anyone to look too carefully at what she is actually capable of. The theory about Maggie is not that she is secretly a genius in the comedic tradition of the precociously brilliant infant. The theory is more specific, more uncomfortable, and more carefully supported by what the show has actually put on screen. Maggie is not hiding her intelligence because she is a baby, and babies cannot articulate complex ideas. Maggie is hiding her intelligence because she has observed what happens in this family, in this town, to people who reveal what they are actually capable of, and she has made a strategic decision that silence is the most powerful position available to her. She chose this. We know she chose it because the show gives us the evidence for the choice. Look at what happens to the most visibly intelligent person in the Simpson family. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Genuinely, unusually, measurably brilliant. She has an IQ that places her in the highest ranges of human cognitive function. She is a gifted musician, a sophisticated thinker, an ethicist, a scientist, a writer. She is the kind of person who, in any environment that actually valued intelligence, would be recognized immediately, encouraged, supported, given the resources and the community she needs to develop into what she is capable of becoming. In Springfield, she is ignored. Not always, not by everyone, not completely, but consistently, systemically, repeatedly. Lisa speaks up and gets talked over. Lisa challenges authority and gets sent to her room. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and gets crushed by the weight of a community that finds her intelligence annoying rather than impressive. Her family loves her. There is no question about that. But her family does not understand her. And the world outside her family, the school, the town, the cultural environment of Springfield, has made its position on brilliant women clear across 36 years of episodes. Brilliance, in Springfield, especially female brilliance, does not make your life better. It makes it lonelier. Maggie has watched this happen every single day of her remembered existence. She has observed her sister fight constantly, exhaustingly, sometimes despairingly, for recognition that arrives inconsistently and disappears quickly. She has seen what displaying intelligence in this environment costs. She has calculated, at some level that operates below language, below conventional expression, the ratio of reward to cost that visible intelligence produces in Springfield. And she has decided that the ratio does not justify the exposure. She watches, she listens, she processes, she files everything away, and she says nothing. Because silence in Springfield is protection. Consider the shooting. The official investigation into who shot Mr. Burns focused on dozens of possible suspects. Adults with motives, with histories, with documented grievances against the victim. The investigation was wide-ranging, often chaotic, occasionally brilliant in its wrong-headedness. Nobody seriously considered the baby until Burns himself said her name. Who suspects an infant? Who even thinks to look at the baby? A baby sitting quietly in a corner, expressing nothing, revealing nothing, providing no information that could be used against her. A baby who, if she is intelligent, would understand from the investigation unfolding around her that the worst outcome for everyone in the room would be for the person responsible to be identified and prosecuted, and that the best outcome for everyone, the outcome that resolves the crisis with the least damage to the family she loves, would be for no one to be convicted, which is precisely what happens when you blame someone who cannot be prosecuted. No jury in the world would convict a baby. The Longest Daycare, the 2012 theatrical short film released before Ice Age. Continental Drift, which was nominated for an Academy Award, gives us the clearest window into what Maggie's cognition actually looks like when the show is willing to depict it directly. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility run with authoritarian precision. Inside the facility, she encounters a caterpillar on the verge of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. A larger, aggressive baby named Gerald wants to destroy it. What follows is a 7-minute short film in which Maggie systematically outmaneuvers the bully, the staff, the facility's security arrangements, and every obstacle between the caterpillar and its freedom. She does this without speaking. She does it through observation, planning, improvisation, and a form of adaptive problem-solving that the film treats not as precocious comedy, but as something closer to genuine strategic intelligence. Watch the short carefully. Maggie does not stumble into the right solution. She does not succeed through luck or cartoon physics. She reads the environment. She identifies the relevant variables. She develops a plan, and then adjusts the plan when circumstances change. She anticipates other characters' behavior accurately enough to account for it in her strategy. She executes a multi-step operation with precise timing and an apparent understanding of spatial relationships. Her body limits her. She falls over. She crawls when she should be running. Her motor skills are genuinely those of a 1-year-old. And they slow her down constantly. But her decision-making is not limited. Her choices are consistently correct. Her problem-solving is consistently optimal. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support. And she does it in silence, without drawing attention to herself, without asking anyone for help, without revealing to the staff of the facility what she is doing until it is already done. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly in several episodes, and the results range from impressive to extraordinary to completely unmeasurable by standard instruments. The show uses this for quick jokes and then moves on. But the pattern across multiple episodes and multiple direct demonstrations is too consistent to ignore. Maggie is not normal. She is something else. Connect this to the radiation theory and the picture becomes specific. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates mutations, and if those mutations affect each individual differently depending on some combination of genetics, exposure levels, timing, and biological variables that the show does not specify, then the Simpson family represents a spectrum. Homer is one end of that spectrum. His mutation took something away. His cognitive capacity was diminished, both by the environmental contamination and by the physical object in his brain, to the point where he functions at the lower edge of measurable intelligence. The person Homer could have been, the articulate, capable, self-aware man who briefly emerged when the crayon was removed, is present somewhere in his biology. But the combination of radiation exposure and physical brain damage has buried that person under decades of fog. Maggie is the other end. Where Homer's mutation was subtractive, Maggie's is additive. The same environmental cause, the same family, the same contaminated water and irradiated air, produced the opposite result in the youngest Simpson. Instead of diminishing her cognitive function, the mutation amplified it. Instead of a brain operating below normal parameters, a brain operating so far above normal parameters that the show cannot figure out how to measure it. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive equation. He is what happens when mutation takes something away. She is what happens when mutation gives something extraordinary. And the most poignant version of Maggie's intelligence, the reading that makes it emotionally rather than theoretically interesting, comes from the coma theory. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since April 1993 is the product of an unconscious mind trying to hold on to the family it loves, then Maggie's genius is not a biological fact about a character in a show. It is Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child, projected into the dream. He cannot see Maggie grow up. He cannot watch her develop her interests and her personality and her way of moving through the world. He cannot hear her first real sentence, or see her take her first unassisted steps, or learn what kind of person she is becoming. He went into the coma when she was 1 year old, and his sleeping mind has no information about who she has become since. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age. He makes her capable of things no actual one-year-old could do. He makes her safe in the only way his unconscious mind can make her safe, by making her capable of protecting herself. Because in the coma, Homer cannot protect Maggie. He cannot be there for her. He cannot stand between her and whatever the world is preparing to throw at a child growing up in Springfield. So his dreaming mind makes her invulnerable through a different mechanism. Her genius is not a mutation, it is a father's prayer. But back in Springfield, if we accept the show's world as real and leave the coma theory behind, there is another reading, a darker one. Maggie does not speak because she has understood that speaking in this town gets you nothing worth having. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence in Springfield is a liability rather than an asset. She has watched her sister's brilliance earn her isolation and dismissal. She has watched the mechanisms of Springfield respond to anyone who knows too much, by marginalizing them, ignoring them, or, in extreme cases, expelling them. She watches everything. She remembers everything. She understands the full architecture of the world she lives in, including parts of it that none of the adults around her have ever consciously articulated. And she waits. For what? The show has never told us. Maggie's endgame is the last, genuinely unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. Because unlike Homer's coma, or Burns's immortality, or the identity of the shooter, Maggie's future is not something the show has ever accidentally revealed through a flash-forward, or an alternate timeline, or a behind-the-scenes commentary. She remains completely opaque. We have seen her shoot a man. We have seen her command a daycare. We have seen her solve problems that stump adults. We have seen her operate with strategic patience and precision that is consistent across 36 years of episodes. And we have seen the family trust her judgment implicitly, without knowing why they trust it. Without understanding that their implicit faith in the baby's judgment is actually reasonable, because the baby's judgment is better than theirs. Maggie is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably. She cannot speak. She is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace, and she has spent 36 years making absolutely certain that nobody figures that out. And maybe that is the most unsettling thing about her. Not what she has done. Not the man she shot, or the rebellion she led, or the countless small catastrophes she has quietly prevented. What she is waiting to do, behind that pacifier, behind those enormous, still, observant eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate, strategic silence, something is thinking, something is planning, something is watching the family and the town and the world with an intelligence that nobody suspects and nobody can contain. And when Maggie finally decides that the moment is right, when she breaks her silence and reveals what she has been accumulating behind that blank, patient, baby stare, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will. Because that is exactly how she designed it. Consider what it means to be the person in a family who sees everything and says nothing. The role Maggie occupies is not passive. It is not the role of someone who lacks the capacity to engage. It is the role of someone who has assessed the costs and benefits of engagement and made a deliberate decision that the costs outweigh the benefits in this particular environment. She has watched Bart engage with the world by colliding with it, and the result is a series of consequences that reset every week without accumulating into anything permanent or meaningful. Bart's engagement produces noise and entertainment, an occasional genuine connection, but it does not change anything in any lasting way. She has watched Lisa engage with the world by trying to improve it, and the result is a series of small victories surrounded by much larger defeats, and a kind of loneliness that seems to be the specific tax that Springfield charges on intelligence when intelligence makes itself visible. Neither of these strategies has produced the outcome that Maggie appears to be working toward, which is real, durable, structural change. Not a single episode with a happy ending that gets forgotten by the next one. Change that actually sticks. Change that rearranges the underlying conditions, rather than just producing a good day within them. Maggie is thinking at a different timescale. She is not planning an episode. She is planning a series. And when the series finally arrives, when the patient, silent accumulation of observation and information and strategic preparation finally reaches the moment it has been building toward. The rest of Springfield will have no frame of reference for what they are watching. Because they have never taken her seriously. Because she never let them. That is the genius of it. And maybe the most hopeful thing in all of Springfield is that the most capable person in the town is also the one least touched by the contamination of the place, in the sense that matters most, not least exposed to the radiation. Possibly most exposed, but least contaminated by the psychological structures that keep everyone else exactly where they are. She has not been told that things cannot change. She has not yet accepted the loop. She is waiting. And when Maggie finally decides that the moment is right, when she breaks her silence and reveals what she has been accumulating behind that blank, patient, baby stare, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will. Because that is exactly how she designed it. You have probably seen the clips. Someone pulls up a screenshot from a 20-year-old Simpsons episode and holds it next to a news headline from this week, and they look identical. Same image, different year, different decade. Sometimes a different century. And the caption says some version of the same thing it always says. The Simpsons predicted it. The phenomenon is so well established by this point that it has its own cultural ecosystem. There are dedicated compilation videos, social media accounts, articles, and entire corners of the internet devoted to cataloging the instances in which something depicted in The Simpsons eventually happened in reality. The show has been running since 1989, and the predictions, as they are called, have accumulated into a list so long that the length itself has become part of the conversation. Let us go through the most significant of them, carefully and honestly, and then talk about what the phenomenon actually means, because the answer is more interesting than either complete credulity or complete dismissal would suggest. The most famous prediction, the one that put the whole phenomenon on the cultural map, is Donald Trump's presidency. In the year 2000, the episode Bart to the Future aired. The episode depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. In that same episode, the departing president, the one whose term preceded Lisa's, was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired in 2000. Trump won the election in 2016. That is a 16-year gap between the joke and the reality. When Trump won, the internet reacted to this episode with a combination of amazement and unease that generated more discussion about The Simpsons than almost anything the show had done in years. Screenshots went viral. The clips circulated everywhere. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in 2 decades suddenly wanted to know how the show had known. And the answer, from the people who made the episode, was relatively straightforward. Trump had been publicly flirting with the idea of running for president since at least the late 1980s. He had given interviews about it. He had allowed the possibility to be discussed seriously in political circles. He had cultivated a public image that was designed, among other things, to make the question of political ambition feel natural and plausible. The Simpsons writers did not predict a Trump presidency. They observed that Trump was already positioning himself as a potential political figure, noted that this trajectory, extended to its logical conclusion, would produce exactly the kind of presidency the episode depicts, and made a satirical joke about where celebrity culture and political ambition were pointing. Then the country arrived at precisely that destination 16 years later. There is the episode, depicting a device that looks remarkably like a modern smartwatch, from 1995. There is the 1994 episode in which Homer goes to space with Buzz Aldrin, decades before commercial space tourism became a serious industry. There is the 1998 episode, in which Homer discovers a mathematical equation that appears to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was not experimentally confirmed until 2012. There is the 1999 episode, in which Homer proposes that the universe might be shaped like a donut, and the years later discovery by cosmologists of radiation patterns suggesting the universe might actually be toroidal. There is the 1993 episode, in which a flu virus originating from Asia spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic buying, overwhelmed hospitals, and a frantic search for a cure 27 years before COVID-19. And within that same episode, the townspeople accidentally release a swarm of killer bees, which felt particularly strange when Asian giant hornets, dubbed murder hornets by breathless media coverage, showed up in the United States during the actual 2020 pandemic. In 1996, the episode Homer Palooza featured a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra while under the influence of something that impaired their judgment. That exact collaboration actually happened in 2024 when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality. In 1998, an episode depicted Disney acquiring the 20th Century Fox Film Studio, which is the network on which The Simpsons airs. The actual acquisition happened in 2019. Multiple episodes across the series depicted video calling technology before it was commonplace. Autocorrect failures before autocorrect existed. Surveillance culture. Deepfake-style media manipulation. Technologies and social phenomena that felt futuristic in the 90s and feel ordinary now. The list is long enough to fill a video by itself, possibly multiple videos. And every time a new entry is added to it, the reaction is the same. How did they know? Let us take the answer that the show's own creators have given, because it is actually an interesting answer, and it deserves more engagement than it usually receives. Al Jean, one of the show's longest-serving executive producers, has addressed this directly. His explanation is something like, "When you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the target. This is not a dismissal. This is a real statistical argument, and it is correct as far as it goes." The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes. Each episode contains a large number of jokes, references, satirical observations about technology, politics, culture, and society. Over 36 years, that accumulates into an enormous body of predictive content. Thousands and thousands of individual claims about what the future might look like. If even a small percentage of those claims turn out to be accurate, the volume of the show's output means the total number of apparent predictions will be impressive. Bill Oakley, one of the show's writers during what many consider its peak creative period, put it more plainly. Most of the apparent predictions, he said, are cases where history repeated itself, where the show depicted something and then decades later something similar happened. And people noticed the resemblance and called it a prediction. Fact-checking organizations have noted that many of the most celebrated predictions have mundane explanations. The smartwatch gag in 1995 was based on existing research into wearable technology that was already being discussed in technology publications at the time. The Disney-Fox prediction was an observation about media consolidation that was already visibly accelerating when the episode was written. The Trump joke was based on his already public political ambitions. These are not mystical forecasts. They are the output of a writing staff that was paying unusually close attention to where existing trends were heading and extrapolating those trends forward to their logical, often absurd, conclusions. The Simpsons writing room has historically been one of the most academically credentialed in television. Multiple writers with degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other institutions. Writers with backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, political science, physics, and economics. These are not people guessing randomly about the future. These are highly educated, highly observant people reading the present more carefully than most, and then pushing it forward a few steps to see where it lands. They were not predicting the future. They were reading the present better than most people were reading it. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because the statistical explanation, as correct as it is for most of the apparent predictions, does not fully account for all of them. Some of the specific details, the Trump escalator descent that matches the shot from the episode with unusual visual precision, the Siegfried and Roy Tiger attack that matches the actual event in its specific choreography, the Cypress Hill London Symphony collaboration that is so niche it is almost impossible to arrive at through general trend extrapolation. These feel different from the smartwatch or the media consolidation. They feel too specific. And this is where the more interesting theory begins, the one that is more intellectually provocative than any claim about time travel or mystical writing staffs. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through magic, not through prophecy, through cultural influence, at a scale that almost nothing else in the history of American media has matched. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, and most deeply embedded pieces of cultural product in American life. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have become part of the vocabulary that Americans use to describe their own experience. Its observations about politics, media, economics, and culture have become part of the framework through which Americans understand those subjects. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president in 2000, that joke does not simply disappear. It enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point that people carry with them. It becomes a thing people say in conversations about Trump. A shorthand. A shared touchstone. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes a particular future feel familiar before it arrives. It primes the cultural imagination. It makes the idea of a Trump presidency not a shocking impossibility, but a familiar absurdity. Something we have already processed in the context of a cartoon, something that belongs in a category of events that our culture has already developed a vocabulary for. When the punchline arrives, when reality catches up to the joke, it does not feel like an unexpected shock. It feels like recognition. The Simpsons already did this. Of course. We saw this coming. The show did not make Trump's presidency happen. But it did make it feel, to the millions of people who remembered the episode, like something that had already been imagined, already been processed, already been placed in context. And context changes everything. Springfield does not reflect America. America has, to a significant degree, become Springfield. The nuclear power plant, run by a corrupt billionaire, the incompetent safety inspector who keeps his job because the system is designed to keep him there. The town that experiences catastrophe after catastrophe and resets between episodes because confronting the actual weight of what has happened would be too destabilizing to absorb. The population too distracted by the immediate and the entertaining to notice what is being done to them by the people with the power and the money and the infrastructure. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first. And here is the final piece of the prediction phenomenon, the one that is most important for understanding why it persists. The Simpsons has also made thousands of predictions that have not come true. Jokes about jetpacks, moon colonies, technology that was imagined and never built, political outcomes that went another direction entirely, cultural shifts that never materialized, social changes that the show anticipated and that history simply did not produce. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody shares the misses. Nobody builds a theory about the episode from 1997 that depicted a technology that still does not exist 28 years later. Nobody makes compilation videos of The Simpsons predictions that failed. Confirmation bias works in one direction only. We remember the hits and forget the misses. We curate a highlight reel from 36 years of content and call it prophecy, when what we have actually done is filter out everything that did not match and present only the residue. The predictions are not supernatural. They are the product of a brilliantly written show running for an impossibly long time, staffed by some of the most educated and observant writers in television history, generating more satirical content about American culture than any other show in existence, and then having that content filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created, which is the internet itself. The Simpsons wrote enough possible futures that some of them were bound to arrive. And the ones that arrived are the only ones anyone remembers. But try telling that to yourself the next time a clip from 1994 surfaces and lines up perfectly with a headline from tomorrow morning. Because the truth is, even when you understand how the trick works, even when you can account for every statistical and cognitive mechanism involved, it is still impressive to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations, and enough bullseyes to make even the people who wrote the jokes pause for a moment and wonder. Section 7. Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson told his son that his mother had passed away when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned, in the way that Homer mourns, which is to say not consistently or articulately, but with the kind of deep, unexamined ache that shapes a person's emotional architecture without their full awareness. And Homer spent his entire childhood, his adolescence, and the first several decades of his adult life believing he was the kind of son whose mother chose death over raising him. That is not a small thing to carry. That is a wound, a specific, structuring wound that organizes everything else around it. Homer's desperate need for external validation, his clinginess, his terror of abandonment, his willingness to absorb humiliation from his employer rather than risk the security of his job, his compulsive need to be liked by everyone, in every room, even people who treat him badly, even people who have given him no particular reason to want their approval. Homer Simpson's personality is in significant part a coping mechanism for maternal loss. He learned very young that the most important person in his world had left him, and everything that followed was shaped by that lesson. In Season 7, the show revealed that the lesson was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on November 19, 1995, and it is widely considered one of the finest episodes in the show's history, a serious, emotionally honest piece of television that uses the show's comedic structure to tell a story that is genuinely heartbreaking if you let it be. Here is what happens. Homer, attempting to avoid working on a Saturday, fakes his own death. He constructs a dummy and pushes it off a cliff near the power plant, allowing the town to believe he has been killed in an accident. When Marge convinces him to go to the Hall of Records and correct the death certificate before the legal complications become unmanageable, Homer discovers something in the municipal records that rearranges the landscape of his life. His mother is alive. Not dead, not gone, alive. The grave Abe showed him was not hers. The burial plot Abe directed Homer to as a child, the place Homer stood and grieved and learned what it felt like to have his mother taken from him, belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been using a famous writer's headstone as a substitute for his own wife's burial site for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona in the cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, not recognizing the grown man standing next to her as the child she left behind 27 years earlier. And when she finally understands who he is, there is a reunion that the show allows to be exactly as painful and as tender and as complicated as 27 years of absence and grief and love that had nowhere to go should be. She tells him why she left, and the reason connects directly to Charles Montgomery Burns. The depth of this wound is something the show does not always allow itself to explore directly, because exploring it directly would require the show to be the kind of show it is not, at least not consistently. A drama, a tragedy. But it does explore it in moments, in quiet scenes between the comedy beats, in the way Homer reacts to certain things, in the specific shape of his fears, in the particular texture of what he is most afraid of losing. What Homer is most afraid of is being left, being abandoned, being the person that people leave behind when something better comes along, being the kind of son whose mother dies, being the kind of husband whose wife might one day realize she deserves more, being the kind of father whose children might grow up and move away and not call. Everything he does, every decision he makes, every job he keeps, even when it is bad for him, and every relationship he maintains, even when it is demeaning, traces back to the lesson he learned when he was 6 years old. That the people who are supposed to stay sometimes go. And the reason Mona went has been sitting in the show since 1995, in an episode that is simultaneously one of the show's finest pieces of television and one of its most quietly devastating conspiracy theories. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe, living a quiet life in Springfield, with a young son named Homer. She was ordinary in the way that most people are ordinary, living inside the particular texture of their specific day-to-day existence without any particular ambition toward the extraordinary. And then the world outside came in. The late 1960s in America were a period of genuine social turbulence. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the counterculture. Across the country, people who had previously lived their ordinary lives were being confronted with questions about what those ordinary lives were built on and what the people in power were doing in everyone's name. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists. The show depicts them as hippies, as a gentle comedic frame, But it is also explicit that their cause was legitimate and that the target they chose was appropriate. They targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that sit for a moment. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant. He owned a facility designed to produce and store biological weapons. Weapons-grade pathogens, engineered diseases, synthesized biological agents intended for use in warfare. In Springfield, in the same town where Homer was growing up, where children were going to school, where families were living their lives, completely unaware that the wealthiest man in their community was manufacturing diseases in a laboratory down the road. Mona and her group broke into the facility. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological agents stored inside. They were not there to hurt anyone. They were there to destroy the weapons. And during the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard. The security guard, whose asthma they cured, in this moment of accidental medical intervention while detonating an antibiotic device in a bioweapons lab, was Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. This is the universe of coincidences that Springfield runs on, where everything is connected to everything else in ways that would feel contrived in any other context, but that The Simpsons has earned through 36 years of careful, consistent world-building. The raid worked. The biological agents were destroyed. But Mona made one mistake. As the group fled the facility, she saw someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. She stopped. She helped. The person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She helped the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. She helped him up. And in doing so, she looked at him. He looked at her. He saw her face clearly enough to identify her. Burns reported her to the FBI. From that moment, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact Abe. She could not hold her son or explain to him anything about why she was going. She went to Homer's room while he was sleeping, kissed him goodbye without waking him, and disappeared. Homer woke up, and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 27 years believing that there was something wrong with him, something fundamental and unnameable, that had made his mother prefer death, or something worse than death, to staying. The episode's emotional core is the reunion, the 27 years of accumulated grief and love and confusion that Homer carries, and the moment when he understands that his mother did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have endangered him. She left because Burns was watching, because Burns had seen her face, because Burns had the resources and the motivation to pursue her, and coming home would have put Homer and Abe in the path of a man who did not forgive the people who crossed him. Burns pursued Mona actively for decades. When she returns to Springfield in the Season 7 episode, Burns spots her almost immediately. He sees her through a cab window, identifies her on the street after 27 years, and calls the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. And this time he knows why. He knows who destroyed his family. He knows who drove his mother underground when he was a child. He knows who cost him 27 years of the relationship that shaped his personality and defined his deepest fears. And he works for him. Homer Simpson earns his paycheck from the man who stole his childhood from him. And Homer does not connect the dots. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not even seem to fully process, in any sustained way, the connection between the billionaire who signs his checks and the billionaire who made his mother a fugitive. The show does not play this as a joke. It plays it as tragedy. Because Homer is not capable of holding that connection in his mind and following it to its logical conclusion. The cognitive damage, the radiation exposure, the crayon, the decades of accumulated impairment have left Homer without the neurological architecture required to see the pattern that his own life forms. He cannot understand the shape of his own suffering. And this is the conspiracy in its full form. Burns did not simply destroy Mona's life. He engineered Homer's. By driving Mona out of Springfield when Homer was 6 years old, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally stunted, desperate for approval, incapable of sustaining the kind of self-worth that would allow him to challenge authority, terrified of abandonment, Because abandonment was the first major lesson his life taught him. A man with those specific psychological wounds is the ideal employee for Burns. He will not quit, because losing his job would mean losing the closest thing he has to security. He will not organize or advocate or challenge the conditions of his employment, because the alternative, being cast out, being alone, being unloved, is worse than any job. He will absorb humiliation and indignity and being called the wrong name by a man who cannot remember him, because the baseline Homer is working from is a person who woke up one morning and found that his mother had preferred to vanish rather than stay. Burns does not keep Homer employed because he values him. Burns keeps Homer employed because a broken man in Sector 7G is more useful than a competent one. A competent safety inspector would have shut the plant down within a week of being hired. Homer ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns's monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and its population remains uncontested. The show confirms the deliberate architecture of this arrangement in a later revelation. Burns had committed a crime, the details of which were discovered by Grandpa Simpson. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns struck a deal. Homer would have a job at the power plant, permanently, regardless of performance. No matter how many mistakes he made. No matter how many documented errors accumulated in his file. No matter how catastrophically he failed at his responsibilities. 742 documented errors. Homer was never permanently let go. Because the deal protected him. Homer's job security was not a cartoon convenience. It was a contractual obligation, established in secret between his father and the man who had destroyed his family, maintained through silence, and never explained to Homer because explaining the deal would mean explaining everything else. 3 generations of Simpsons, systematically shaped by one man's grudge. Grandpa, who discovered something about Burns and chose to trade silence for his son's employment rather than pursue accountability. Mona, who fought against Burns's weapons program and lost everything. Homer, who inherited the consequences of both without ever understanding what had happened. And Burns, who won every round. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules, and the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the power plant until he dies. Because his grandfather made a deal. Because his mother made a choice. Because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Mona Simpson died in a later episode. The death scene is quiet and specific in the way that the show's best emotional moments are. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. The show does not use it for comedy. It does not use it for satire. It does not cut away or reset or find a joke to soften the weight of the moment. It is just a man and his mother, and the 27 years they did not have. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the jokes, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling down and getting back up and landing headfirst in the same situations for the same reasons with the same lack of self-awareness, there is a story about a family that was broken by one man's power. Mona fought back and lost everything. Abe made a deal with the person responsible and buried the truth. Homer inherited the damage without ever being given enough information or enough cognitive capacity to understand where it came from. And Burns won. And Springfield went on. And every morning, Homer gets in his car and drives to work at the facility owned by the man who took his mother from him, and he parks in the same spot and sits in the same chair and does not quite manage to do the job he was hired to do. And the reactor hums. And the cooling towers leak. And the water runs yellow downstream. And nothing changes. Because in Springfield, nothing is allowed to change. Section 8. Where is Springfield? The location mystery. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can name Springfield, identify its landmarks, describe its geography, and navigate its streets from memory than can name the capital city of half the states in the actual country. The nuclear power plant, the tire fire, the gorge, the butte, the harbor, the monorail, the elementary school, the prison, the hospital, the Quickie Mart, Moe's Tavern, the town square, the Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace, with the picket fence and the snowball in the driveway. These places are more vivid to more people than the actual geography of their actual region. And nobody Not a single person in 36 years of audience engagement has been able to definitively establish where Springfield is. Not what state it is in, not what region, not what coast, not what climate zone, not what electoral district, nothing. The show has been contradicting itself about Springfield's location since the first season, and the contradictions are not minor variations around a general area. They are wholesale incompatibilities that place the same town simultaneously on the East Coast and the West Coast, in the North and the South, near the Canadian border and near Mexico, in a desert and on an ocean shore, and in deep mountain country, and on flat Midwestern farmland. Springfield has all of these things: mountains and ocean and desert and forests and farmland, all within the same driving distance from downtown. No actual American town has that combination of geographic features. No location exists in the country where all of these landscapes are simultaneously accessible. Springfield's geography is not internally consistent. It is deliberately, persistently, carefully inconsistent. Let us look at what the show has established over the years. The show has depicted Springfield as having a harbor significant enough to support commercial shipping. It has depicted Springfield as having mountain ranges close enough to be visible from downtown and accessible for day trips. It has depicted Springfield as having a desert in or near the town. It has depicted Springfield as having a river, a gorge, an active volcano, accessible by short drive, a coastline, a forest, and agricultural land. Springfield has been shown to border, at various points in the show's run, the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, bordering 4 states that are not adjacent to each other and are in some cases on opposite sides of the country. The state abbreviation shown in various episodes has included NT, which is not an abbreviation used by any actual American state. When Homer calls the state capital in one episode, the answering voice describes the state as one beginning with a vowel, which narrows the field meaningfully but not conclusively, and which was immediately followed by episodes that contradicted even this limited clue. Matt Groening, the show's creator, gave an interview in 2012 to Smithsonian Magazine in which he addressed the question directly. He named Springfield, Oregon, as the inspiration for the town's name. He said he chose Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in the country, present in numerous states, and because he grew up near the Oregon Springfield. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared solved. Springfield was in Oregon. The creator had said so. Then the show continued to contradict it. Episodes aired after the interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts incompatible with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's public statement by adjusting future episodes to be consistent with it. They kept building the contradiction, because the contradiction, it turns out, was never accidental. It was never a case of the writers not keeping track of what they had established. It was a decision. A deliberate, sustained choice to keep Springfield permanently, irresolvably ambiguous about its location. And the reason for that choice, the surface reason that Groening and the writers have acknowledged in various interviews over the years, is straightforward and makes complete sense as a creative strategy. A Springfield that could be anywhere is a Springfield that belongs to everyone. If Springfield is definitively in Ohio, it starts to feel like an Ohio show. Ohio viewers feel a particular ownership. Viewers in California, or Texas, or New England, start to sense a slight geographic distance between themselves and the world of the show. The emotional universality that makes The Simpsons feel like everyone's show rather than a regional show begins to erode. But a Springfield that is simultaneously everywhere, that contains geographic features drawn from every region of the country, that could be your town regardless of where your town actually is, that Springfield belongs to everyone equally. Every viewer can see their landscape somewhere in it. The town is designed to feel like home, no matter where home is. This is the official explanation. It is probably true. It probably reflects a genuine creative intention that Groening and the writers had from the beginning and have maintained consistently. But the theories we have been exploring tonight suggest a different dimension to the same phenomenon. If the radiation theory is true, if Springfield is a contamination zone, where the laws of biology have been bent by decades of nuclear exposure, why should geography be exempt from the distortion? If the people of Springfield can have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive injuries that should be fatal, if their fish have 3 eyes and their dog has mutant proportions, and their billionaire employer, glows green in the dark. Why should the physical landscape around them obey the ordinary rules of American geography? Maybe Springfield has mountains and ocean and desert in close proximity because the contamination does not stop at the human population. Maybe the radiation has warped the physical space around the town in ways that compress geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region. Maybe the same force that altered the residents has altered the terrain. And if the coma theory is true, the geographic impossibility is the simplest thing in the world to explain. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise, surveyed map of the country in its memory. It has impressions, emotional associations, fragments of places experienced and half-remembered, mountains from a vacation that was mostly forgotten, ocean from a television commercial, desert from a movie he saw in a theater somewhere in the middle of his life, farmland from a drive through the middle of the country where nothing in particular happened but the landscape registered anyway. His unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered or saw or dreamed about, layering them on top of each other without regard for geographic logic, because dreams do not have geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. Springfield feels like America because it is assembled from Homer's memory of America, scattered, incomplete, held together by longing rather than cartography. And then there is the interpretation that follows from the principle and the Popper theory, which we will discuss in more detail in a later section, but which applies here directly. You cannot bring federal charges against a nuclear power plant if you cannot establish which state it is in. You cannot enforce environmental regulations if the jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. You cannot conduct a meaningful regulatory inspection if the inspecting agency cannot determine whether it has authority over the facility being inspected. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is not just a creative choice, and it is not just a dream logic phenomenon. It is a legal shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent state attorney general to investigate the facility with the cracked cooling towers and the 342 violations, no fixed relationship with any state government that might feel empowered to act on the documented contamination of its water supply. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means someone shows up with a map and a badge and starts asking questions that Burns would prefer not to answer. And here is the thing about accountability in Springfield. The one time it seemed like it might actually arrive. The one time an external authority looked at the town and made a definitive judgment, that authority did not bring accountability. It brought a dome. The EPA, when it finally assessed Springfield's environmental situation in the film, did not fine Burns. It did not shut down the plant. It did not require remediation. It sealed the town. It contained the problem by containing the population. That is not accountability. That is quarantine. And Burns, inside the dome with everyone else, immediately began working on a way to escape and preserve his interests, which is what Burns always does. The geographic ambiguity of Springfield and the dome that eventually descended over it are expressions of the same underlying truth. Springfield is a place that cannot be regulated by normal means. It exists outside the jurisdiction of whatever authority might otherwise apply. It is accessible enough to sustain itself as a community, but inaccessible enough, in some fundamental way, to avoid the oversight that should come with being a community in a country that has environmental and safety laws. The town escapes accountability through ambiguity, through uncertainty, through the simple, durable strategy of never being quite definitively anywhere. And Burns, the man who built the power plant and who has structured the entire economic and social architecture of the town around the continuation of his enterprise, benefits most from this ambiguity. Because if Springfield ever had a fixed, incontrovertible location, if the regulatory authority were clear and the jurisdiction were established and the oversight mechanisms were functioning, someone would have shown up a long time ago with a list of 342 violations and a demand that they be addressed. Springfield is nowhere in particular, so nobody in particular is responsible for it. And Burns stays where he has always been. At the top of everything? Watching. The episode that comes closest to giving Springfield a definitive location, the Season 12 mockumentary Behind the Laughter, stated in its original broadcast that the family was from northern Kentucky. This was enough information. It was a definitive answer. The show had finally committed. Then the syndication version aired. And the location was different. The answer, the definitive answer that the show had finally given, was changed for reruns. Not corrected for an error. Changed. Replaced with a different location. Depending on which version of the episode you have seen, Springfield's location is something different. Even when Springfield has a definitive answer, the answer is not definitive. It shifts. It changes based on where and when you are watching. The show gave you the truth and then made the truth context-dependent. Every state in the country has been proposed as Springfield's home at some point. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence against it. The show has sustained this ambiguity for 36 years, and it shows no signs of resolving it. Springfield will never be located. Not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided long ago that uncertainty is more useful than resolution. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. And a town that belongs to everyone is a town nobody can shut down. Section 9. The floating timeline and why nobody ages. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then, and she is 8 now. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They still are. Maggie was 1 year old. She still is. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The characters exist in a permanent present tense. They are locked at the ages they were when the show began. Experiencing a world that continues to modernize and change around them while they remain static. Their technology updates, their cultural references update, the things they watch on television and the phones they use and the news events they react to are all contemporary. But the characters themselves do not age. Bart has been 10 for longer than most of the people currently watching the show have been alive. He will almost certainly still be 10 when many of those viewers are bringing their own children to watch The Simpsons for the first time. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means that the show's present is always the viewer's present. The year outside the screen is always the year inside the screen. The technology is contemporary, the references are contemporary, the world the characters inhabit is perpetually synchronized with the world the audience inhabits. But the characters' ages, their relationships, the fundamental structure of their lives, none of that is allowed to change. Most viewers accept this as simply how long-running animated shows work. The characters look the same in episode 740 as they did in episode 1 because they are drawn figures rather than aging human beings. And drawing figures the same way across time requires far less explanation than the aging of an actual cast would. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has generated contradictions so enormous, so internally inconsistent, that they have started to pull at the foundations of the show's own world. The most visible of these is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was grounded in the 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific cultural era. Their courtship was set to music from that time, in fashion from that time, against a backdrop of cultural references that placed them definitively in the late 70s. Their love story was a 1970s love story, that was where it lived. But if Homer and Marge are currently in their mid-30s, and if the show's present is synchronized with our present, then they cannot have met in the 1970s. They would have been born in the 1980s or 1990s. They would have met in high school in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Their formative years would have been defined not by the cultural references of the era the show began in, but by whatever decade corresponds to high school for people currently in their mid-30s. The show has acknowledged this by periodically rewriting their origin story. Homer and Marge's courtship has been depicted in flashback episodes set in multiple different decades. In different retellings, they are grunge fans from the early 90s. In others, they are young people defined by the early internet era. In others, they are something closer to millennials navigating a more contemporary set of cultural references. Their past is not a fixed historical fact. It is a draft that gets rewritten to maintain the illusion of a permanent present. The characters do not have histories. They have approximations. Whatever backstory is required to make the current episode work is the backstory that applies, and when the next episode needs a different one, the old version is simply discarded. Now apply the theories. Every single theory we have explored in this video converges on this point. They arrive from different directions, using different evidence and different logical frameworks, and they all land in the same place. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer went to sleep in April 1993 with his family at specific ages, and his dreaming mind cannot age them past the moment when he lost them. His children are preserved at the ages they were when the vending machine fell. His wife looks the way she looked that morning. His friends are the people they were on that day. Because that is the last day his conscious mind was updated with new information about them. The radiation theory says nobody ages because their biology has been so fundamentally altered by decades of nuclear contamination that normal biological processes, including aging, have been disrupted at the cellular level. The same mutation that gives Blinky a third eye and makes Homer's skull defy standard human biology may have also interfered with the cellular mechanisms responsible for biological aging. The principle and the Popper theory, which we are about to discuss, says nobody ages because Springfield has collectively agreed to ignore any truth that threatens the stability of the status quo. And the truth that time is passing, that the children are growing, that the parents are getting older, is the most destabilizing truth of all. So the town voted, in whatever collective, unspoken way it votes on these things, to ignore it. The Burns immortality theory says at least one person in Springfield has already negotiated a workaround with time, which means that the concept of aging is already flexible in this universe in ways that it is not in the real world. All four theories are saying the same thing in different languages. Time does not work in Springfield. Whether it is the radiation, or the coma, or the collective denial, or the medical technology of the wealthiest man in the region, something in Springfield has broken the normal flow of biological time for the people who live there. The floating timeline is not a production convention that the show uses, because it is convenient. It is a symptom. It is the show telling you, through the structure of its own format, that these characters are trapped, locked in a loop, cycling through variations of the same lives without ever progressing, without ever growing, without ever reaching the conclusion that time should eventually deliver to every living thing. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done it multiple times. The most famous instance is the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, which flashes forward 20 years to show Lisa as a young adult, engaged, living in England, navigating a complicated relationship between who she has become and where she came from. The future the episode depicts is detailed and specific and emotionally rich. Lisa has become the person the show has always suggested she might become. She is brilliant and principled, and somewhat lonely in the specific way that very intelligent people can be lonely when they outpace the environments that formed them. The episode is one of the warmest and most quietly sad things the show has ever produced. And the detail that makes it particularly resonant, the detail that cuts the deepest, is what happens when the flash-forward Lisa thinks about her family. She has moved away. She is engaged to someone who represents a different world, a more sophisticated and refined world. The world that her intelligence pointed toward and that Springfield could never have offered her. She is becoming the person she was always going to become. And she misses Springfield. She misses the imperfect, contaminated, strangely amber-preserved world she grew up in. She misses the family that she outgrew and cannot quite leave behind. She misses being 8 years old with her saxophone in her room, and her father doing something ridiculous downstairs, and her mother calling everyone to dinner with that particular note of patience and determination in her voice. The future Lisa knows, in a way that present-tense Lisa cannot yet, that the imperfection of Springfield was also its gift. That the things that made her want to leave are inseparable from the things she will spend the rest of her life missing. This is what the flash-forward episodes do when the show allows them to function fully. They show you what the permanent present protects everyone from knowing. That growing up means leaving, and leaving means loss. And the thing that was preserved in amber, the thing that was kept exactly as it was at the cost of never being allowed to grow, turns out to be the thing you most wanted to hold on to. The floating timeline is not just about production convenience. It is about grief. It is about the specific grief of time, which is that the things we love most are also the most subject to change. And the preservation of them, even artificial preservation, even the impossible preservation of a cartoon family frozen at their 1,989 ages, is the closest we have ever gotten to holding on to them. It proves that The Simpsons can imagine its characters older. It can envision what their futures might look like. It can tell those stories with the emotional complexity and specificity that the characters deserve. But after the episode ends, Lisa is 8 years old again. The future is sealed back up. The permanent present resumes as if the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And this refusal is not just about The Simpsons. It is about what The Simpsons represents. The Simpsons is the American family. Not one American family among many, but the American family in a symbolic sense. The one that American culture has agreed to use as a reference point. A mirror. A shared touchstone for what family life in this country means, and what it costs, and what it offers. They have been that thing for longer than any other fictional family in the history of American television. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must always be the father who means well and fails spectacularly, and somehow loves his family enough that the failures do not destroy what matters. Marge must always be the patient, slightly underappreciated center of gravity that holds everyone together through the force of her quiet insistence that the family is worth holding together. Bart must always be the rebellion and the mischief and the essential good heart underneath all of it. Lisa must always be the idealism and the intelligence and the loneliness of being the person in the room who sees clearly in a world that does not reward clear vision. Maggie must always be the mystery, the silence, the potential that has not yet declared itself. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpson family is allowed to age, the moment Bart turns 11 and Lisa gets her driver's license, and Maggie starts talking, and Homer is too old to keep stumbling through the same door, and Marge is left in a house that has gotten quieter and quieter over the years, the show stops being a comedy about a family. It becomes something else. It becomes an elegy. The story of a family that ran out of time. And America does not want that story. America has never wanted that story, which is why the show has been running for 36 years, and why the ratings still hold, and why new generations of viewers find it and love it and make it part of their own cultural vocabulary. America wants the version where the kids are always young, where the parents are always together, where the house always looks the same and the couch is always there, and the opening credits always play, and Sunday night at 8 o'clock always brings you back to the same family in the same house on the same street. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement. These characters are frozen in time because we need them to be. Not because the show is lazy, not because the writers could not figure out a way to age them gracefully, but because they represent something we have collectively decided we cannot let go of. The chaotic, loving, messy, resilient American family. The family that survives everything, that recovers from everything, that resets after every disaster and starts fresh the next week. The Simpsons do not age because aging means ending. And the American family is not allowed to end. Not in television, not in our imagination, not in the dream of a man in a hospital bed in a town that does not appear on any map. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every Sunday night to make sure the walls are still standing and the family is still intact and the timeline is still floating. And every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before half the people in the room were born, we tighten the loop a little. We make it a little harder for the Simpsons to escape. Because if they escape, if the timeline stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie finally says her second word, then the show ends. And the show ending means admitting something. It means admitting that the version of America it represents, the chaotic, resilient, eternally optimistic version of the middle-class American family, was always temporary, was always fragile, was always one birthday away from dissolving into something we do not recognize anymore. The Simpsons are trapped in a loop because we trapped them there. We pressed pause in 1989, and we never pressed play. And now here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family in the same house on the same street in the same impossible town, waiting for something to change. Knowing nothing will, because we will not let it. Section 10. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the Forgotten Tragedies of Springfield. There are two characters in Springfield, whose stories the show has been telling quietly, in the background, without the dramatic weight it gives to the central family, and without the analytical attention that most fan theories apply to the major players. One of them is possibly the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The other is possibly the saddest person in all of Springfield, which is a meaningful claim in a town that includes Homer Simpson. Let us begin with Hans Moleman. If you have watched The Simpsons for any significant period, you know who Hans Moleman is. He is tiny. He is elderly, or appears to be. He wears thick glasses that suggest severe vision impairment. He has a small, soft voice that carries a perpetual quality of mild resignation, as though he has long since made peace with the understanding that things are not going to go well for him. And they never do. Hans Moleman dies in The Simpsons. Not occasionally. Not when the plot requires it. Regularly, repeatedly, in canonical episodes that are not dream sequences, or holiday specials, or alternate reality framings. In the ordinary continuity of the show, Hans Moleman dies. He is struck by cars. He is crushed by objects. He is buried alive. He is eaten by animals. He falls from heights. He is electrocuted and incinerated and suffocated and attacked and subjected to forms of physical harm that would end any ordinary life decisively and permanently. By conservative estimate, he has died dozens of times over the course of the show's run. And then he appears in the next episode, completely fine, with no explanation and no acknowledgement of the previous death. He is simply there again, walking through the background of Springfield, ready to be killed again. The fan response to Moleman is overwhelmingly to treat this as a running gag, which it is. He dies a lot. It is dark comedy. It is a recurring bit. Move on. But under the framework of the theories we have been exploring, Moleman's situation is not a gag. It is a mystery with specific, disturbing implications. If the radiation theory is true, Moleman represents the most extreme mutation in Springfield. Not the most visible, not the most famous, but the most extreme in a particular biological sense. Homer heals from injuries that should be fatal. His recovery rate is implausible, his resilience is superhuman, but he does not die and come back. He endures and heals. Those are different things. Moleman actually dies. His body ceases to function. And then he is alive again the next week. If radiation can give a fish a third eye and turn Homer's skull into a shape that defies human biology and make Burns glow green in the dark, what has 36-plus years of Springfield's contaminated environment done to Hans Moleman's biology? Something has given him the ability to reconstitute after death. Not survive. Reconstitute. To come back from a state of actual cessation and resume existing, as though death in Springfield, for certain residents, is not a permanent condition but a temporary one, a biological reset triggered by whatever the nuclear plant has done to his cellular structure over the years. Death, for Hans Moleman, is a revolving door. There is another data point about Moleman that tends to get missed in the chaos of his repeatedly fatal existence. He once stated his age. He said he was 31 years old. Look at him. Whatever Hans Moleman looks like, he does not look 31. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s. He has the physical presentation of a man who has lived a very long time and not particularly enjoyed much of it. The soft voice. The failing vision. The general physicality of someone who has been old for a long time. If he is telling the truth, and there is no particular reason within the show's universe to believe he is lying, something happened to Hans Moleman that aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in what should have been his productive adult years and compressed decades of physical deterioration into his body. The radiation theory has an answer for this. Long-term, high-level radiation exposure produces accelerated cellular aging. It damages the cellular machinery responsible for normal replication and repair. It can turn a 31-year-old body into something that looks decades older. The same environmental force that may have given Moleman his extraordinary biological resilience, his apparent inability to die permanently, may also have accelerated his physical aging to the point where his exterior and his interior age are profoundly mismatched. He looks like a very old man because something aged him rapidly. And he cannot die permanently because the same something also made his cellular structure capable of recovery from fatal trauma. Hans Moleman is what happens when Springfield's contamination produces its most extreme result in a single person. Extraordinarily accelerated aging combined with extraordinary biological resilience. He looks ancient, and he cannot die. And nobody in Springfield finds this worth investigating. Which is, of course, the most Springfield thing about the whole situation. A man dies in broad daylight, regularly, in front of witnesses, in canonical episodes, and the town does not respond. There is no investigation. There is no community meeting. There is no public health concern raised about the pattern of a specific resident dying and then inexplicably reappearing. Springfield simply incorporates Molman's deaths into the background texture of daily life, the way it incorporates everything else that should be alarming. The three-eyed fish was alarming. A gubernatorial candidate turned it into a campaign issue. Burns was forced onto television to eat the fish and assert that it was safe. There was, briefly, a collective acknowledgement that something was being indicated by Blinky's existence. And then Springfield moved on. The dome came down over the entire town and was eventually lifted, and Springfield moved on. Homer saw a glowing alien in the woods, and the FBI came, and it turned out to be their billionaire employer receiving weekly radiation treatments to stay alive, and Springfield moved on. A man dies every few weeks and comes back, and Springfield has moved on so thoroughly from this that the show rarely even acknowledges it as a running gag anymore. It is simply part of what Springfield is. A place where impossible things happen, and nobody asks why. Now, Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders is, on the surface, everything Homer Simpson is not. He is kind, generous, physically fit, financially responsible, devoutly religious, patient with his children, a good neighbor to someone who gives him almost nothing in return. He donates to charity. He maintains his property. He attends church. He volunteers. He extends grace to people who have done nothing to deserve it, and he does this consistently, in episode after episode, across 36 years of the show. By any objective measurement of character, Ned Flanders is a substantially better person than Homer Simpson. And the show punishes him for it. Ned's wife Maud was killed at the Springfield Speedway when a t-shirt cannon misfired and the shirts it launched hit her instead of their intended target. She fell from the bleachers. She died. The cannon misfired because Homer was dodging the t-shirts rather than letting them land normally. Homer's selfishness caused the cannon operator to aim elsewhere. The shirts struck Maud. Homer's behavior directly, causally, resulted in Ned Flanders losing his wife. And Ned forgave him. Not eventually, after a period of understandable anger and grief and the slow, difficult work of choosing forgiveness over resentment. He forgave Homer with a thoroughness and a speed that the show uses to demonstrate something specific about Ned's character. He cannot not forgive. The apparent inability to sustain anger, the reflexive forgiveness, the relentless patience and grace, these are not presented by the show as uncomplicated virtues. They are presented as something more complicated, more uncomfortable. Because the episode Hurricane Nettie, which is among the most psychologically candid episodes the show has ever produced, reveals why Ned Flanders is the way he is. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents were beatniks, genuinely non-traditional people who did not believe in discipline, whose approach to child rearing was permissive to the point where the child they were raising had no structure, no limits, no consistent external regulation of his own behavior. Young Ned was, by the episode's account, essentially feral. His parents took him to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, through a program of intensive behavioral modification that the episode depicts as having lasted years, systematically conditioned the aggression and anger out of him. Not addressed, not worked through, conditioned away. The psychiatrist spent years making Ned incapable of feeling or expressing anger in any externally directed way. He built a psychological structure around the feral child, a structure of enforced niceness and compulsory forgiveness and reflexive grace that contained the person Ned was before the intervention. Ned's kindness is not a character trait. It is a cage built around a person who, underneath the conditioning, is still the child who needed to be contained in the first place. And the cage holds, most of the time. Ned forgives Homer. Ned is patient with his difficult children. Ned is generous to his neighbors. Ned does everything right because doing everything right is the only mode available to him. The alternative, the person he is when the conditioning slips, is someone he cannot afford to be. But there are moments when the cage shows its seams. When the town rebuilds Ned's hurricane-destroyed house so poorly that it immediately collapses, Ned breaks. He has a complete psychological disintegration on the street in front of everyone. He says things he has been holding for decades. He insults the people who have failed him and frustrated him and taken his goodness for granted. He says things that are true and devastating, and that he has absolutely no mechanism for saying under normal circumstances. And then he is institutionalized. And the psychiatrist who treated him originally examines him again and identifies the problem. The conditioning did not work the way it was supposed to. It suppressed the anger without resolving it. The anger is still there, still present, still accumulating, still pushing against the cage. The cage is strong enough to hold it most of the time, but under sufficient pressure, it fails. What does this mean for every other instance of Ned's patience? If his forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death was not grace but compulsion, if his kindness to his neighbors is not generosity, but the only behavioral mode available to a person whose alternatives have been chemically and therapeutically foreclosed, then what does Ned Flanders' life actually feel like from the inside? What is it like to have lost your wife in an accident caused by your neighbor's selfishness? To have forgiven that neighbor not because you freely chose forgiveness, but because your brain will not let you do otherwise. And then to continue living next door to that person, helping him, supporting him, being the endlessly available resource that Homer has always treated Ned as? What is it like to do everything right, every day, for 36 years, and receive nothing that the show recognizes as adequate compensation? Because here is the detail that makes the Ned Flanders situation the most theologically and philosophically pointed thing the show has ever done. God talks to Homer. Homer, of all the people in Springfield. Homer, who sleeps through church. Homer, who has an IQ of 55 and a crayon in his brain and a history of using Sunday morning as an opportunity for the kind of sleep you cannot get during the week. Homer, who by every observable religious metric is the worst churchgoer in a town that includes Principal Skinner and Sideshow Bob. God talks to Homer. God does not talk to Ned. In the show's own established canon, the divine presence has engaged with Homer Simpson directly, has held conversations with him, has offered him guidance and prophecy. God and Homer have a relationship that is depicted as genuine, if irregular and often comic. And Ned Flanders, who has dedicated his entire life to his faith, who attends every service, who reads the scriptures, who prays, who tries to live according to the principles he was raised to believe matter, has never once received a comparable communication. Homer gets divine conversation. Ned gets silence. This is not random. The show is making a statement. In Springfield, the system does not reward goodness. It rewards compliance. And Homer, impaired and desperate and afraid of being alone, is in some ways the most compliant person in the town. He does not challenge the structure. He does not organize or resist or ask too many questions. He shows up, he does his inadequate job, he comes home, he sits on the couch. Burns's system needs Homer. God, within the show's universe, seems to need Homer too, for whatever theological purposes the divine might have in a Springfield, that appears to be the specific location of much of what is most broken about American life. And Ned, who does not serve any of these systems the way Homer does, who is not compliant in the specific way that makes him useful to the structures of power and capital that control Springfield, Ned gets nothing. He does everything right. He gets nothing. Homer does almost everything wrong. He gets divine attention. Ned Flanders is what happens when you sincerely try to be good in a system that does not reward goodness, that does not even recognize goodness as a currency worth holding. His reward for decades of grace and generosity and forgiveness is a dead wife, a poorly rebuilt house, a neighbor who will never understand what Ned has given him, and a God who appears to be more interested in the people who are not really trying than in the person who has organized his entire existence around trying. That is not a comedy beat. That is the show telling you what it thinks about the relationship between virtue and outcome and the kind of world it has been depicting for 36 years. There is also the matter of the specific nature of Ned's faith. Ned is not a casual believer. He is not someone who attends church out of habit or social obligation. He is someone who has organized his entire interior life around a theological framework that he takes completely seriously. He prays. He reads his Bible. He applies his faith to his daily decisions in ways that require real thought and real commitment. He is the kind of person that any religion would point to as an example of what genuine devotion looks like in practice. And within the show's universe, this dedication has produced exactly nothing in the way of spiritual reward. Homer has had face-to-face conversations with God, multiple ones. God has appeared to Homer, spoken to Homer, offered Homer guidance and prophecy. The divine presence, within the canon of The Simpsons, is real and accessible and has a personal relationship with Homer Simpson, who by any religious metric is the least devout person in Springfield. Ned has been waiting for 36 years. The silence is not incidental to his character. It is the central tragedy of his character. A man who has done everything he was told would work, who has followed every instruction, who is committed genuinely and completely to a spiritual practice that promised him a connection to something larger than himself, and who receives nothing in return, not even an acknowledgement that the waiting is noticed. Imagine that. Imagine doing everything right for 36 years and hearing nothing back. And then imagine that your neighbor, who does almost nothing right, keeps having conversations with the thing you have been waiting to hear from. That is Ned Flanders. That is the specific, particular, quietly devastating situation that the show has placed him in, and left him in across an entire television generation. The cage that was built around him as a child prevents him from expressing the full weight of what this costs. He cannot be angry. He cannot be bitter. He cannot allow himself to sit with the injustice of his situation in any sustained way, because the psychological conditioning that was applied to him before he was old enough to consent to it foreclosed those responses. He smiles. He says hi diddly ho. He waves at Homer across the fence. He goes back inside and reads his Bible. And he waits. The show has given Ned a few companions in his loneliness over the years. A second marriage, briefly. A relationship that ends badly enough that it reads as confirmation that the universe has specifically targeted Ned for a particular kind of suffering that it applies consistently regardless of what he does. He lost his wife to Homer's selfishness. He loses his second significant relationship to a combination of circumstances that feel specifically designed to deny him the thing he most needs. And Ned, because Ned is Ned, forgives everyone involved. Because he has to. Because the alternative is not available to him. There is a moment in one of the show's later seasons in which Ned, at the end of a particularly difficult stretch of episodes, is standing in his kitchen alone at night. The house is quiet. His sons are in bed. There is nothing dramatic happening. He is just standing there. And he looks, for just a moment, like a man who is very tired. Not tired from activity. Tired from carrying something heavy for a very long time without being allowed to put it down. The show does not linger on the moment. The camera moves on. The episode continues. Whatever Ned was feeling in that kitchen is not explored or resolved. But it was real. Whatever the show was depicting in that moment, it was honest. It was the show acknowledging, quietly and without fanfare, that the life of a good man in Springfield is not a rewarded life. It is just a life. One day after another, grace and patience and silence. And the fence. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that does not punish wrongness. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. They live next door to each other. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. And the gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who does not, has never once closed. Because in Springfield, the gap does not close. The system is not designed to close it. The system is designed to keep Homer at the power plant, and Ned at the church, and Burns at the top, and Hans Moleman in the ground, and everyone exactly where they are, forever, in a loop that never breaks. That is Springfield. That is the show. That is 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes of mysteries and theories and buried storylines and contradictions and impossible things that happen and get forgotten and happen again. Reduced to its simplest form, a town where nothing changes, where nobody grows, where time does not pass and consequences do not stick. And the same family sits on the same couch in the same house every single week, watching the same television, living the same life, preserved in the same loop that began in 1989 and that has no visible end. Conclusion. Why we can't let them go. We have spent 3 hours in Springfield. We started with the nuclear power plant and the invisible poison that the canonical evidence suggests has been quietly mutating every resident of the town for decades. We moved through the coma theory and the heartbreaking possibility that every episode since April 1993 has been a love letter from an unconscious man to the family he cannot reach. We reopened the Burns shooting case and found the official answer riddled with unresolved questions. We traced Burns's impossible longevity to the weekly radiation treatments that keep his disease equilibrium intact and his empire operational. We looked behind Maggie's silence and found something extraordinary. We counted the predictions, understood the mechanism, and arrived somewhere more interesting than either complete belief or complete dismissal. We followed Mona Simpson's trail from 1969 to the present, and found 3 generations of a family systematically shaped by one man's grudge. We searched the map for Springfield and found it everywhere and nowhere. We stared at the floating timeline until the loop stared back. We spent time with Hans Mollman, dying and returning, in the background of a town too damaged to find this strange. And we sat with Ned Flanders, in the space between what he deserves and what he gets, which is one of the most quietly devastating spaces in all of television. Every theory we explored is different. Different evidence, different logic, different assumptions about what the show is and what it is trying to say. But every single one of them arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental, something structural. Something that goes deeper than animation conventions or episodic storytelling or cartoon logic or any of the other explanatory frameworks that are offered when someone asks why things in the show work the way they work. Whether it is radiation, or a dying man's dream, or collective denial, or institutional corruption, or the sheer accumulated weight of existing for 36 years without ever being allowed to change, something has broken the rules of reality in this town. And the show has been telling you about it since the first episode. Not through dramatic reveals or explicit exposition, through accumulation. Through the patient, decades-long layering of detail upon detail upon detail until the picture, if you are willing to look at it directly, becomes undeniable. The Simpsons is not hiding its mysteries. It is showing them to you every single week. It is just that nobody in Springfield can see them because Springfield will not let them. And nobody in the audience can see them because we have been watching long enough that we have become Springfield ourselves. We have accepted the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who will not die and the town that will not change. We have normalized it all. We have become the people who look at a 3-eyed fish and say that is just how things are around here. But they do not have to be. The theories exist because some people looked at Springfield and refused to accept the surface. They dug. They connected. They asked the questions that the characters cannot ask because the characters are trapped inside the loop. And what they found is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than the show presents at face value. A version where Homer's impairment is not a comedic trait, but a scar left by a system that broke his family before he was old enough to understand what was happening to him. Where Maggie's silence is the smartest strategic decision anyone in the family has ever made. Where Burns's immortality is the logical conclusion of what unchecked wealth does when it is given enough time and enough resources and no meaningful opposition. Where Marge's patience is the load-bearing wall of a structure that would collapse without it. Where Bart's chaos is the only sane response to a world that has stopped making sense. And where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and alone, keeps asking questions that nobody wants answered, keeps pushing against the walls of a world that would prefer she sat quietly, because she is the only person in Springfield who has not yet stopped looking. That is The Simpsons. 36 seasons. Nearly 800 episodes. The longest-running animated series in the history of American television. The most analyzed, most theorized, most dissected show ever created. And after all of it, after all the theories and all the evidence and all the hours spent trying to crack the code, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is our town. Not any specific town any of us grew up in, but the idea of the town. The town where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever changes, and the same arguments happen at the same kitchen table, and the same bar, and the same workplace, and the same church. Maybe because Homer is our father. Not the father any of us had necessarily, but the father we recognize. The one who loves his family with his whole chest and cannot quite figure out how to show it. The one whose life is harder than it looks from outside, and whose failures are more understandable than he would ever be able to articulate. Maybe because Marge is the person in our lives who holds everything together, quietly, without sufficient acknowledgement, through sheer patient love. And we watch her do it on television every week because we do not always remember to notice it in our actual lives. Maybe because Bart is who we wanted to be when we were 10 years old. The one who did not care what anyone thought. The one who pushed back. The one who was funny and reckless and alive in a way that felt like freedom. And maybe because Lisa is who we should have been, or tried to be. The one who saw things clearly and could not stop saying so, even when the room wanted her to stop. And maybe because Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep hidden, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting for the right moment that never quite comes. Or maybe it is simpler than all of that. Maybe we cannot let them go, because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the world has changed in ways we did not fully authorize or entirely want, that the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits is gone, or in someone else's house, or somewhere we cannot go back to. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10, and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the door after another impossible day, and the couch is always there, and the family is always assembled, and the television is always on, we do not have to admit any of that. We can turn on the show. We can go back to Evergreen Terrace, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. The mysteries we explored tonight will never be officially resolved. The show will not confirm the coma theory. It will not acknowledge the full implications of the radiation theory. It will not reopen the Burns shooting case. It will not explain Hans Moleman's deaths, or reveal why Ned Flanders' God has never spoken to the one person in Springfield, who spends every Sunday waiting. But that is not why we explored them. We explored them because the best stories are the ones that keep opening up, the ones that have more inside them than they appear to on the surface, the ones that reward attention with something unexpected and honest, and occasionally heartbreaking. The Simpsons is that kind of story. It has been that kind of story for 36 years. It will be that kind of story for however long it continues. And the loop will keep running. Homer will keep finding his way home. The kids will stay young. The beer will stay cold. And every Sunday night the couch will be there. And so will they. There is one more thing worth saying before we close. We spent a lot of time tonight on the darker theories. The contamination theory. The coma. The conspiracy that runs through 3 generations of one family. The structures of power and denial that keep Springfield exactly as it is, regardless of what any individual resident might want or need or deserve. And all of that is real within the show's universe. All of it is supported by the evidence. All of it is part of what The Simpsons is. But it is not all of what The Simpsons is. Because underneath every dark theory, underneath the contamination and the coma and the corporate corruption and the collective amnesia, there is something else. Something smaller and more persistent and harder to theorize away. There is a family on a couch. Homer and Marge. Bart and Lisa and Maggie. 5 people squeezed together in a living room watching television while the credits roll. The poses change every week. The couch gag shifts and evolves and invents new ways to deposit them in the same spot, but the fundamental image is always the same. 5 people. 1 couch. Together. Everything else in Springfield is wrong. The water is contaminated. The safety inspector is cognitively impaired. The most powerful man in town has been keeping the most important man's mother from him for decades. The principal is not who he says he is. The town votes to sustain lies. The fish have 3 eyes. The billionaire glows green. Nobody ages. Nobody remembers. Nobody asks the questions that most need to be asked. All of it is wrong, but the family on the couch is right. Whatever else The Simpsons is, however dark the theory, however deep the analysis goes, the show always comes back to that couch, that family. That insistent, unkillable, unconditional bond between 5 people who have no particular reason to be extraordinary and who are extraordinary anyway, in the specific way that ordinary families are extraordinary, which is to say, invisibly, In the private language of shared meals and inside jokes, and knowing when someone needs the television turned up and when they need it turned off. That is the thing that no theory fully accounts for. Not because the theories are wrong. They are mostly right. The contamination is real. The coma might be real. The conspiracy is definitely real. But the family is also real. It is the most real thing in Springfield. It is the reason any of the rest of it matters. And it is the reason we keep coming back. Not for the mysteries. For the couch. For the family on it. For the feeling, 36 years deep and still present, of sitting down next to people who love each other in the only way any of us know how to love each other, which is imperfectly and completely and without any real plan for how it is all supposed to work out. That is Springfield. That is the show. Thank you for spending 3 hours in Springfield with me tonight. If you are still awake, well done. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way, that was always the point. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Good night.